Hello there and welcome. If this is the very first time you've wandered into this quiet corner of the internet, I'm glad you found your way here. And if this is not your first night with me, if you already know this feeling, the one where the world gets a little softer and a little slower, welcome back, friend. Either way, I am happy you're here. Most people believe the cat curled up beside them tonight has always belonged to us. That somewhere long ago a human reached into the wild and gently tamed a small, frightened animal, and that was that. But that is not what happened. Not remotely. For hundreds of thousands of years, the ancestor of every cat alive today wanted nothing to do with us. Nothing at all. Tonight we go back to the desert, to the dark, to the moment before any of that ever changed. Before we go there, let me ask something small of you. If nights like this one spent falling asleep to a good slow story are the kind of company you enjoy, think about tapping that subscribe button. It costs nothing, and it truly helps a quiet little project like this one keep going. A like on this video or sharing it with someone who also drifts off best to a story, instead of silence, means more than you might guess. And if you have a spare moment before you get too comfortable, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I love imagining all the different corners of the globe this story is reaching all at once while everything else goes quiet. Now get settled, dim the lights if you can, maybe switch on a fan or anything nearby that hums softly in the background, something to hold the silence steady while we travel a long way back together. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow down to match mine, and when you are ready, let's begin. Tonight we're going to follow one small solitary hunter across 10,000 years of history, through deserts and grain stores, through temples and ships, through fear and worship and everything in between, until we arrive at the very cat curled up in your own home right now or the one you wish were there. But first we have to meet her. Long before she belonged to anyone, back when she was only completely herself. Picture the desert just after sunset somewhere in what is now the border country between Turkey, Syria and Iraq. The sand is still warm from the day, but the air is turning cold fast the way desert air always does once the sun disappears. A small shape moves along the edge of a dry riverbed, low, silent, almost invisible against the pale rock. Her coat is sandy gold, faintly striped like the shadow patterns dry grass leaves on stone. Her ears rotate on their own tracking, a sound too quiet for a person standing nearby to ever notice. Somewhere beneath a tangle of thorn bush, a small jerboa is digging. She's already heard it. This is Felis libica, the African wildcat, not some distant cousin of the cat sleeping near you tonight, her direct ancestor. Every single domestic cat alive on Earth right now, from a stray slipping behind a restaurant in Rome to a pampered longhair stretched across a designer sofa in Los Angeles, traces its family line back to an animal exactly like her. Watch her move for a moment. Notice how little sound she makes. Her claws stay tucked away, hidden inside soft padding until the instant she needs them, so not even a grain of sand shifts under her weight. Her whiskers spread wide on either side of her face brush the air itself, measuring the width of every gap she passes through, in total darkness, without a single misstep. And behind her eyes sits a thin mirror-like layer of tissue that catches every last scrap of moonlight and bounces it back through the retina a second time. It is the reason a cat's eyes seem to glow faintly if a light ever catches them at night. It is also the reason she can see clearly in conditions that would leave a person groping blindly at the dark. She weighs somewhere between 6 and 13 pounds, barely bigger than the cat that may be sleeping on your lap this very moment. Her territory, though, is enormous by comparison. Depending on how much prey the land can support, a single wildcat may claim a hunting range covering several square miles all for herself. Not for a pack, not for a family group, for herself and no one else. Here is the part most people get wrong. We tend to picture the wild ancestors of our pets as pack animals waiting somewhere in the shadows for a chance to join a human tribe. But this particular hunter was not waiting on anyone. She did not belong to a group. She did not answer to any hierarchy. By nature, she did not need another living creature at all, not for hunting, not for safety, not for company. So what kind of animal has no real interest in company? What kind of hunter needs no one to survive, no one to protect her, no one to help her raise young or share a kill? And what on earth could ever convince a creature built for total solitude to walk toward the flicker of a human fire? It helps to compare her for a moment to another wild animal, whose story is about to run parallel to hers thousands of years earlier and thousands of miles away. Long before any wildcat ever looked twice at a human settlement, the ancestors of the dog wolves were already forming loose, cautious alliances with early hunter-gatherers, trailing behind hunting parties, scavenging carcasses, gradually learning to interpret human body language with startling precision. Wolves already lived in cooperative family groups. They already understood pack loyalty, shared effort, and taking direction from a leader. In a strange way, wolves were practically pre-trained for partnership with people long before the partnership ever began. The wildcat had none of that. Nothing in her instincts prepared her for cooperation of any kind with anyone of any species. If domestication were only a matter of temperament and social wiring, she should have been one of the least likely animals on the entire planet to ever end up sharing a roof with a human being. Scientists who study small wildcats will tell you that most feline species, large or small, share this same architecture of independence. Lions are the strange exception, the only cats that form true social groups with shared hunting and shared young. Nearly everyone else in the cat family, tigers, leopards, bobcats, and the sandy-coloured hunter, we're watching tonight spend the overwhelming majority of their lives alone, hunting alone, and only tolerate another cat's company for a few days a year during mating season. Some researchers believe this solitary instinct evolved because dry open country simply could not support large groups of hunters sharing such small scattered prey. Others trace it back even further into instincts carried by the very first cat-like predators that walked the earth long before deserts like this one ever existed. Maybe it was the harsh math of survival in dry country. Maybe it was something written into the species millions of years earlier. Or maybe, and this is the answer that quiets even the experts, we will simply never know for certain why cats almost alone among the world's great predators chose a life without a pack at all. Just her, just the hunt, just the silence. It is worth pausing on just how long this particular arrangement had already lasted. The wider cat family had been prowling the earth for several million years by this point, largely unchanged in shape and habit, long before the first human ever stood upright on two legs. Empires would rise and crumble in the blink of an eye compared to a stretch of time like that. Entire mountain ranges would form and wear back down again, and through all of it, animals built almost exactly like her had been hunting alone in the dark, needing nothing from any one generation after generation after generation. Now picture that same animal hours earlier in daylight folded into a sliver of shade beneath a limestone outcrop. Wildcats are creatures of night and in between hours, dawn and dusk, when the desert finally cools enough for both hunter and prey to move safely. Through the brutal heat of midday, she barely stirs at all. Her body slows down on purpose, saving every ounce of energy for the hours when hunting actually pays off. If you've ever wondered why the cat sharing your home seems to sleep an almost impossible number of hours a day, somewhere around 16 on average, you're looking at an inherited habit, not laziness. Her wild ancestor did the exact same thing for the exact same reason tens of thousands of years before anyone ever dreamed of putting a cat on a couch. It turns out the laziest looking pet in most American households was simply following a survival strategy old enough to predate farming, writing, and the wheel. She was never spoiled, she was efficient. Her descendants just got extremely comfortable, proving it one long nap at a time. A wildcat like her might catch and eat somewhere around a dozen small rodents in a single good night. Her hearing can pick out the rustle of a mouse under dry leaves from more than 30 feet away. Her eyes let her move with total confidence through darkness so complete a person would be nearly blind in it. She needed none of that from us. She already had everything a hunter could possibly want built directly into her own body. And even though she never seeks out company, she's not entirely silent to the wider world around her. Solitary does not mean isolated. As she moves through her territory night after night, she rubs her cheek along low branches and sun-warmed stones, leaving behind a scent no human nose would ever notice, but that any wandering wildcat would recognize instantly. It works almost like a note left on a door. This ground is taken. Move along. Other wildcats pick up that quiet signal, and more often than not simply turn away rather than risk a fight neither one of them can afford to lose. Her whole social world is built on messages left behind in passing, never on a face met head-on. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If she had every advantage, if she needed nothing from humans, feared very little, and answered to no one at all, then why out of every wild hunter roaming that ancient landscape is she the one whose descendants now sleep on pillows by the hundreds of millions? Why her and not the fox, not the jackal, not any of the dozen other small predators sharing that same stretch of desert? What was it about this one animal that made all the difference? Something in her behavior, maybe. Something written into her biology. Or perhaps it came down to something far less poetic than any of that. Simple timing. Foxes and jackals lived across that same landscape, hunting many of the same small animals, and in some ways they were even more adaptable than she was. Yet neither one became humanity's companion. Some researchers point to temperament wildcats, unlike foxes, seem to carry a slightly higher natural tolerance for being near larger animals, including us, without panicking and fleeing. Others point to appetite wildcats specialize almost entirely in exactly the kind of small grain-loving rodents that were about to become a very serious problem for human beings. It may not have come down to one single quality at all. It may have been an unlikely combination, a coincidence of nerve diet and unbelievably fortunate timing. Maybe it was her nerve, maybe it was her diet, or maybe more honestly it was simply that she happened to be standing in the right desert at the right moment in human history, whether she had asked for it or not. No one chose her yet, not really, not on this particular night. Let's return to that same evening, the gerbil still digging unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows above it. If you lifted your gaze from that dry riverbed and looked out across the wider valley, you would notice something new sitting on the horizon. Small clusters of light. Not lightning, not stars. Fire. If the night was still enough, and if you had ears half as sharp as hers, you might even catch the faint murmur of human voices carried across the open ground, and under it the thin, sharp smell of wood smoke drifting out over sand that had never smelled anything like it before. Around this same stretch of time, somewhere between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, something extraordinary and completely unprecedented was beginning to take shape in this part of the world. Small bands of people who had spent their entire history on the move following herds and seasons across open country were starting to do something no human community had ever managed before, not at any real scale. They were staying put. Right around this time in this exact stretch of land, some of the very first permanent human villages on the planet were beginning to rise. Small clusters of mud brick homes, early clumsy attempts at planting grain instead of only gathering it wherever it happened to grow wild. It was the earliest flicker of what we now call the agricultural revolution, and it was about to change absolutely everything. Not only for the humans laying those first walls, but for a small solitary hunter who had never asked for any of it, and had no idea it was already headed her way. She had no idea, of course. On this particular night she was thinking about nothing but the yerba beneath the thorn bush. She'd gone her entire life, and her entire species had gone tens of thousands of years without needing a single human being for anything. But something about that new cluster of light glowing faintly on the horizon, something about the smell of stored grain, and the small scurrying pests it would soon attract in astonishing numbers was quietly about to reach all the way out into the open desert and rewrite the future of her entire bloodline. For now she catches her meal in total silence, exactly as her kind always had, and slips back into the dark, answering to absolutely no one. But hold on to that small flicker of firelight sitting on the edge of her territory, because everything that happens next in the story of how one solitary self-sufficient hunter became the most quietly successful animal on the planet begins the moment she finally decides to walk toward it. Follow that firelight a little closer, and you will not find a village built with cats in mind at all. You will find something far more ordinary and, as it turns out, far more important. A pile of grain. Somewhere in the hill country that's now northern Syria, southern Turkey and Iraq, a small cluster of mud brick homes huddles together around a shared open space. It is early morning. A woman kneels beside a woven storage basket taller than her own waist, packed tight with wild wheat and barley. Her people spent the entire autumn gathering by hand. She lifts the woven lid and stops. Something is wrong. A corner of the basket has been chewed clean through. Grain spills across the packed earth floor and threading through it small unmistakable tracks. Tiny footprints, droppings. The unmistakable evidence of a visitor nobody invited. She was not the first person to make this discovery, and she would be nowhere near the last. Because something had just happened quietly and without ceremony that would end up shaping the next 10,000 years for an entire species of small striped predator that up to this point had wanted absolutely nothing to do with people. Here is a question worth sitting with before we go any further. When you picture the beginning of humanity's bond with cats, what image comes to mind? Maybe a farmer scooping up a stray kitten out of pity. Maybe a lonely hunter deciding on a whim to keep a wild animal as company. It is a nice picture. It is also almost certainly wrong. The truth is far less sentimental, and honestly a little funnier. This entire relationship did not begin with a cat at all. It began with a mouse, around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago in this same stretch of the Fertile Crescent. Human beings were doing something no one on the planet had ever managed to do before at any real scale. They were staying in one place year after year, growing wild grasses into something closer to what we would now recognize as wheat and barley, and storing the surplus to survive the lean months. It was one of the great turning points in the entire story of our species. It was also, without anyone realizing it at the time, the single greatest gift anyone had ever handed to a rodent. Wild mice are opportunists by nature. Give a breeding pair of house mice a safe, dry, endlessly stocked pile of grain, completely undisturbed by the predators that once kept their numbers in check out in open country, and their population does not simply grow. It explodes. A single pair under good conditions can produce several litters in a single year, each one holding half a dozen pups or more, and those pups are capable of breeding again within weeks of being born themselves. Do the math over a single growing season, and a handful of uninvited mice can become hundreds, all of them living, eating and breeding inside the one resource an early farming family could not afford to lose. Mice were not the only creature quick to notice what human settlement had accidentally created. Sparrows began nesting in the eaves of these same mud brick walls. Pigeons found ledges to roost on. Certain beetles and grain moths thrived inside the stored harvest itself, unseen until the damage was already done. Without ever intending to, humans had built an entirely new kind of habitat, dense, food-rich and predictable, in a way nothing in the wild had ever been, and every opportunistic species within reach was quietly moving in to take advantage of it. In this sense, our striped hunter was not special yet. She was simply one guest among many, drawn not by any bond with people, but by the same practical arithmetic every other uninvited visitor was already running. This was not a minor inconvenience. For a family whose entire survival through the winter depended on that basket lasting until the next harvest, a rodent infestation was not an annoyance. It was closer to an emergency, and where there are that many rodents concentrated in one small, predictable place, something else was bound to notice eventually. We left our striped hunter in the last stretch of this story catching her meal in the open desert and slipping back into darkness, answering to no one. Picture her now, some nights and some years later, standing at the edge of that same kind of village at the tree line where wild scrubland meets the first mud brick walls humans had ever built to stay. She is not there for the people. Let's be honest with each other for a moment. She could not care less about the people. She is there because for the first time in her entire evolutionary history, prey that once took an entire night of patient stalking to find across miles of open desert is now sitting in one convenient overflowing pile guarded by nothing more dangerous than mud brick and silence. From a purely practical standpoint, this was the best hunting ground she had ever encountered in her life. Here is where most retellings of this story get something important backwards. They frame it as though humans looked at a wild, dangerous predator and thought that animal seems friendly, let's invite it into our home. That is not remotely what happened. No early farmer walked out into the scrubland and coaxed a wildcat inside with an offering of milk. If anything, the opposite is closer to true. It was the cat who made the first move entirely on her own terms, driven by nothing more complicated than an easy meal, while the humans involved most likely spent a long stretch of time simply tolerating her presence, without particularly understanding or even noticing what was quietly beginning to take shape at the edge of their fields. So what actually convinced a solitary hunter built for total independence to keep coming back to a place full of the one species she should have had every reason to avoid? Researchers who study this exact question point to something surprisingly unglamorous personality. Not every wildcat in that landscape would have been equally willing to approach a noisy, smoky, unfamiliar human settlement no matter how many rodents were waiting there. Wild animals, cats included, show real variation in boldness the same way people do. Some individuals are naturally more cautious, quick to bolt at the first unfamiliar sound. Others are naturally bolder, more willing to tolerate a strange new risk if the reward is large enough. In that first generation of cats drawn toward human grain stores, it would have been the boldest individuals, the ones with just slightly less fear of something new, who reap the reward of that easy hunting ground, while the more anxious, more cautious cats stayed well back in the safety of open country. And here is the part that quietly changes everything. The boldest cats, the ones willing to tolerate proximity to humans, were also the ones most likely to survive well, eat well, and successfully raise the next generation of kittens near that same abundant food source. Generation after generation without a single person ever making a conscious decision to breed a tamer cat, nature was already doing exactly that kind of selecting on its own, simply by rewarding boldness with better meals and more surviving offspring. Some researchers describe this as the earliest possible seed of tameness itself, planted by nothing more intentional than the local math of who eats well and who does not. Others argue we should be careful not to overstate how quickly or how deeply this shift actually reached into the animal's temperament, since a cat still capable of surviving entirely alone in open country is a very different creature from one that has truly lost its wariness of people. It may be that both are true at once. The very first faint outline of trust was already forming generation by cautious generation, long before anyone would have called these animals tame in any real sense at all. Maybe it began with boldness, maybe it began with hunger, or maybe, and this is the version that keeps most historians appropriately humble, it began with nothing more dramatic than a lucky handful of individual cats who happened to be just slightly less afraid than their neighbours at exactly the moment human beings started leaving enormous piles of food sitting out in the open. If you keep a cat of your own, and it happens to be one of the bolder ones marching straight into a room full of strangers with total confidence, While a more anxious cat would already be hiding under the bed, you're watching a version of that exact same original trait running quietly through 10,000 years of descendants. If this sounds almost too tidy to believe an entire species quietly self-selecting, through nothing more than boldness and better meals, it helps to look at a far more recent, far better documented experiment that shows this exact mechanism at work. Starting in the middle of the 20th century, a Soviet scientist named Dmitry Belyaev began breeding silver foxes on a fur farm, choosing only the calmest, least fearful animals in every generation to breed forward based on temperament alone. Within a strikingly small number of generations, something unexpected began happening. The foxes did not simply grow calmer around people. Their ears started to flop, their tails curled, patches of white fur appeared on coats that had always been a uniform silver-black traits that had nothing obvious to do with fearlessness at all, but that arrived bundled together with it anyway, as though calmness and a softer, more youthful appearance were tangled up somewhere in the same genetic thread. Nothing quite that fast or that dramatic happened to the Wildcats gathering at the edge of those first grain stores, and it is worth being honest about that difference. Their story unfolded across thousands of years, not a few dozen breeding seasons, and no person was ever choosing which cat got to raise the next litter. And yet, the underlying engine driving both stories, boldness quietly rewarded with survival, generation after generation reshaping a population without a single deliberate decision, is similar enough to make the comparison worth holding on to as this story keeps unfolding. Let's go back for a moment to that woman kneeling beside her damaged grain basket. She likely never saw the connection unfolding right outside her walls. From where she knelt, all she knew was a simple, frustrating fact: something kept eating her family's food. What she almost certainly did notice over time was something else entirely. Fewer scattered droppings near the storage baskets some mornings, fewer chewed through corners, and every so often at the edge of firelight, two pale eyes watching from the shadows, gone again the instant anyone turned to look directly at them. Did she understand even a little what she was looking at? Did she connect those disappearing rodents to that quiet, watchful shape at the tree line? We will never know for certain, and it is worth resisting the urge to romanticize an answer we simply do not have. What we can say with real confidence is that somewhere in exactly this kind of ordinary, unremarkable moment, repeated across hundreds of villages and hundreds of years, an unspoken agreement was slowly taking shape. Nobody wrote it down because writing itself would not exist for thousands of years yet. Nobody signed it. And yet both sides, without ever meaning to, were already beginning to hold up their end of it. There is something worth noticing in the shape of this early bond, something that has less to do with cats specifically, and more to do with how trust tends to form in general, whether between two species or two people. It rarely begins with one grand gesture. It rarely begins with either side deciding in a single dramatic moment to fully let its guard down. More often it begins exactly like this: small, repeated, low-stakes evidence offered quietly, and without any promise attached that the other party might be worth tolerating a little longer. Fewer chewed baskets this week than last week. A shape at the tree line that never quite steps forward, but never fully disappears either. Trust in most of its real form seems to get built this way. Not handed over all at once, but earned in installments too small for either side to notice adding up. If you want a modern comparison, think of it less like adopting a pet and more like the oldest pest control contract on record one, where neither party ever sat down to negotiate the terms, and neither one ever fully trusted the other, and yet both kept quietly showing up anyway because it worked. Before we go further into this story, take a slow breath with me for a moment. Whatever position you happen to be lying in right now, let yourself settle a little deeper into it. If you have not already told me where you're tucking in from tonight or what time it is where you are, there is still time to leave a note before sleep pulls you the rest of the way under. I like knowing this small quiet story is landing in so many different places all at the very same time. What we're describing here did not happen everywhere in the world at once, and it certainly did not happen quickly. It likely unfolded across many separate villages over many separate generations, cats and people circling one another at a careful, comfortable distance for a very long stretch of time before anything resembling real closeness took hold. Some of those early bold cats would have stayed only for a season drawn by grain one year and God the next. Others, especially the females who found it easier to raise kittens safely near a reliable defended food source, would have stayed far longer generation, folding quietly into generation, each one just a little more used to the noise and the smoke and the strange upright animals wandering nearby. And somewhere in that slow, patient overlap, something else entirely unexpected was beginning to stir. Not everyone in this story was content to simply let the cats come and go, on their own terms, showing up for a season and vanishing the next. Somewhere among these earliest farming communities on a coastline we still have not named tonight, certain people were about to do something no one anywhere had ever attempted with an animal quite like her before. They were about to pick her up, to hold her against their chest, feel her heartbeat hammering with fear against their own, and carry her down to the edge of the water toward a wooden vessel bound for a smudge of land on the horizon that her kind had never once set a paw on in its entire existence. An island with no wildcats of its own, no way back if the choice turned out to be a mistake, only water in every direction, and a stranger's arms holding her steady the whole way across. The stranger's arms carrying her across open water belong to a story we cannot fully see. No record of that crossing survives, no name, no voice, nothing but the outcome it left behind. But roughly 3,000 miles away, and about 9,500 years later, in the summer of 2004, a small team of archaeologists working under the Mediterranean sun was about to find the closest thing to proof that a moment like it ever happened at all. The dig sat at a place called Kambos on the southern coast of Cyprus, a Neolithic settlement site that had already given up years of pottery shards, tool fragments, and the ordinary bones of goats and pigs that once fed an early farming community. None of that was unusual. Archaeology most days is patient, unglamorous work. You brush away soil in careful layers, log every fragment, and hope that somewhere in the dust, the past is willing to say something worth hearing. Cyprus in the middle of summer is not a gentle place to spend your days on your knees in a shallow pit. The heat presses down early and stays late. Every trowel stroke kicks up a fine pale dust that settles on sweat-damp skin and clings there for the rest of the day. Most finds on most afternoons are exactly what you would expect from a small farming village, broken pottery, a scatter of worked flint, the bones of animals eaten centuries before anyone alive today was born. It is the kind of work that teaches patience through sheer repetition, one careful layer at a time, most of it ordinary, almost none of it remarkable. Then, in one modest grave, the team led by archaeologist Jean-Denis Vigne uncovered something that made even seasoned excavators stop and look twice. A human skeleton roughly 30 years old at the time of death laid to rest, with a small collection of polished stone tools and seashells beside the body, and just 40 centimeters away, near enough to have been placed there on purpose, rather than dropped by accident, a second skeleton. Small, feline, positioned in the same orientation as the human beside it, as though the two had been laid down together on the same day as part of the same quiet act. Here is a number worth sitting with for a moment. 40 centimeters is roughly the length of a person's forearm. That is the distance separating a human being from an animal that, as far as anyone had ever proven before this excavation, was not supposed to be living anywhere near people at all, let alone sharing a grave with one. For decades leading up to this discovery, the accepted timeline of the cat's relationship with humanity had a very confident, very tidy answer: ancient Egypt. Most textbooks, most museum placards, Most casual conversations about the history of cats pointed to the same period somewhere around 3,600 or 4,000 years ago as the moment cats first became something more than wild animals wandering near people. It was a clean story. Egypt worshipped cats. Egypt must have started the whole thing. This one modest grave on Cyprus did not just add a footnote to that story, it broke it. Because this burial was roughly 9,500 years old, meaning the bond between humans and cats was already established, deliberate, and apparently meaningful enough to mark with a joint burial roughly 5,000 years before the first Egyptian temple to a cat goddess was ever built. 5,000 years. To put that in perspective, that is a longer stretch of time than separates you tonight from the construction of the first pyramids. You might reasonably wonder how anyone can state a number like 9,500 years with real confidence rather than simply guessing at how old a set of bones happens to look. Most of that confidence comes from radiocarbon dating, a method that tracks the slow, steady breakdown of a naturally occurring form of carbon found inside anything that was ever alive, whether bone shell or seed. Every living thing absorbs a small predictable amount of this carbon while it is alive, and the moment it dies, that carbon starts breaking down at a fixed, well-understood rate, almost like a very slow hourglass sealed inside every bone in the ground. By measuring how much of it remains, researchers can work backward with real precision. It is not guesswork dressed up as certainty. It is closer to counting the rings inside a felled tree, except here the tree is written into the atoms of an ancient skeleton itself. So here is a question worth turning over slowly in your mind before we go any further tonight. What does it actually take to prove that an ancient burial like this one was not simply a strange coincidence? A cat could have died naturally near a human grave. It could have fallen into an already dug pit. Bones settle in strange places over thousands of years, and archaeology is full of tempting patterns that turn out on closer inspection to mean nothing at all. This is where the island itself becomes the real witness in the case. Cyprus has never in its entire recorded natural history had a native population of wildcats. Not now, not 10,000 years ago. Not at any point archaeologists or biologists have been able to identify. Even during the depths of the last ice age, when global sea levels dropped low enough to shrink the distance between many islands and their neighbouring mainlands, Cyprus remained separated from the nearest coastline, the region we now call the Levant, by a stretch of open Mediterranean water, wide enough that no wildcat could ever have swum, walked or wandered its way across on its own. Which leaves exactly one explanation for how a wildcat ended up on that island at all roughly 9,500 years ago, buried beside a human being. Someone brought her there, deliberately, by boat. Picture what that actually would have involved for a moment rather than skimming past it as a simple historical fact. Small Neolithic vessels of this era were not large, sturdy ships. They were modest, likely unstable craft built for coastal hopping, rather than open ocean crossings rowed or paddled by hand across water that could turn dangerous with very little warning. Loading a living, frightened wild animal onto a boat like that, an animal with claws, teeth, and every evolved instinct screaming at her to fight her way free of anything holding her against her will, was not a casual errand. It was a choice someone made on purpose, accepting real risk and real inconvenience for a reason that must have felt worth it to them at the time. Why would anyone bother? It helps to compare this decision to the other animals that same community was already choosing to bring with them wherever they resettled. Goats and pigs, whose bones also turn up across this same excavation site, made obvious sense as travel companions. They provided meat milk, hide an immediate and easily explained return on the trouble of transporting them. A wildcat offered nothing so simple. She was not food. She could not be milked, herded, or put to work pulling anything. If early Cypriot settlers were making a coldly practical list of which animals justified the risk and expense of an open water, crossing a solitary wild hunter, with a taste for biting anyone who handled her carelessly, should have ranked near the very bottom of that list if she made it onto the list at all. Some archaeologists argue this points to something we might reasonably call an early form of companionship, or at the very least deliberate ownership an animal considered valuable enough, whether for practical hunting purposes or something closer to genuine attachment, that its owners refused to leave it behind when they set out to build a new life on unfamiliar shores. Others take a more cautious position, suggesting the cat may have first been brought along as useful cargo protection, guarding grain supplies packed for the voyage itself, and only later, once the settlement was established, did anything resembling a personal bond develop between a particular cat and a particular person. Both readings agree on the one detail that actually matters most for our story tonight. This was not an accident. It was a decision. Maybe she was carried across that water as a companion already loved. Maybe she was carried as a working animal, valuable cargo rather than cherished company. Or maybe, and this is the answer that keeps honest researchers appropriately careful, the truth sits somewhere in between those two categories, in a way our modern language for pets and property was never quite built to describe. A boat, an island with no way back, and a decision that changed everything. This cypress grave did not stand entirely alone once researchers went looking for company. Around the same broad window of time, cat remains some showing signs consistent with human settlement, rather than pure wilderness began turning up at early village sites in what is now Israel, dated to roughly 9,000 years old. Neither of these finds on its own would have been enough to rewrite the textbooks. Together, spread across different sites and confirmed by different research teams working independently of one another, they built something far more convincing than any single grave could manage alone. A pattern, and patterns in archaeology are exactly what get taken seriously. A single strange bone might be an accident. A repeated finding echoing outward from multiple corners of the same ancient region starts to look a great deal more like a story that actually happened, told honestly by the ground itself long after every human witness to it had turned to dust. The cypress grave was not the only clue hinting that something meaningful was already stirring around this same window of time. Elsewhere across the region, archaeologists have turned up engravings and painted pottery from roughly this same age that appear to show small cats, deliberately and repeatedly not tucked into the background of some larger scene, but placed front and centre, as though the artist considered the animal worth the effort of carving on purpose. We're getting ahead of ourselves by dwelling too long tonight on what that early artistic attention might have meant. That particular thread deserves its own unhurried unravelling later in this story. For now it is enough to notice that people were already thinking about this animal, in ways that reached well beyond simple pest control. At almost exactly the same moment someone chose to bury one beside a member of their own family. Let your eyes rest for a moment if they have not already started to shut on their own. Wherever you are curled up tonight, let the weight of your own body sink a little further into the mattress beneath you. If sleep is already tugging at the edges of your attention, that is exactly what this story is here for. Stay with me a little longer if you can, and if you cannot, that is perfectly all right too. There is something worth pausing on here, a shift that happened not just in the story of the cat, but in the story of how we tell history at all. For a very long time, the confident version of this timeline, the one that started firmly in Egypt, went largely unquestioned, not because the evidence was strong, but because nobody had gone looking hard enough in the right places to challenge it. One careful excavation on a Mediterranean island was enough to move an entire accepted history back by roughly 5,000 years almost overnight. It is a useful reminder, and not only about cats' certainty in history is often less permanent than it sounds, resting quietly on whatever evidence happens to have been dug up so far, waiting for the next patient archaeologist with a soft brush and a great deal of stubbornness to prove it incomplete. If you have ever found yourself repeating some confident fact you picked up somewhere along the way only to discover years later that the story had quietly changed underneath you while nobody told you, you already understand exactly what happened to cat history in 2004. Let's return one more time to that grave itself, because there is a detail worth sitting with before we move forward. Alongside the human skeleton, researchers found small polished stones and seashells items that appear to have been placed there with real care, the kind of small offerings people tend to leave only for someone or something that mattered to them. We will likely never learn this person's name, their voice, or what exactly they felt as they buried a striped hunter that less than a handful of generations earlier would have wanted absolutely nothing to do with anyone at all. What we can say, standing at the edge of that quiet grave 9,500 years later, is that somewhere in the space of only a few hundred years, a purely practical relationship built around rodents and grain baskets had already grown into something people were willing to mark physically permanently in the ground. That is a remarkably short amount of time for a wild predator's entire relationship with an entire species to shift so completely. Think about how quickly that shift would have needed to happen, biologically speaking, for a species built almost entirely around solitude and self-reliance. A handful of centuries is barely a heartbeat in evolutionary terms, nowhere near long enough for slow old-fashioned natural selection to work its usual unhurried magic on something as fundamental as an animal's core temperament. And yet there she was, many generations removed from that first bold ancestor who once dared to approach a grain store already considered valuable enough to be carried across open water, rather than simply left behind to fend for herself the way her kind always had, which raises a much bigger question than any single grave can answer on its own. If no person sat down and consciously decided to tame a wildcat, if there was no breeding program, no training regimen, no deliberate plan behind any of it, then what exactly was actually happening underneath the surface, in the blood and instincts of these animals themselves, to make a transformation like this possible at all? That question does not have a simple answer, and it will not be found with a trowel or a soft brush, no matter how carefully, and no matter how long anyone keeps digging. The real answer is written somewhere far smaller and far stranger than pottery or bone. It is written inside the cat herself, coiled invisibly into every cell of every descendant she ever produced, waiting patiently for a very different kind of scientist, working with tools no Neolithic farmer could ever have imagined to finally learn how to decode it. Blood and instinct do not sit still for a camera the way pottery and bone do. You cannot brush soil off a heartbeat. So if the real answer to what happened inside these animals was ever going to surface, it would not come from a shovel. It would come from a laboratory, a very large refrigerator full of tiny sample vials, and one geneticist stubborn enough to spend years chasing an answer that most of the scientific world had simply stopped questioning. His name was Carlos Driscoll, and in the years leading up to 2007, he set himself a task that sounds almost absurd once you say it out loud. Collect blood and tissue samples from nearly 1,000 cats spread across the entire world, wild and domestic alike, and use their genetic code to finally answer a question nobody had been able to settle with pottery paintings or bones alone. Where exactly did the modern house cat actually come from? Getting a blood sample from a cooperative house cat sitting on a veterinarian's table is one kind of challenge. Getting a usable genetic sample from a fully wild cat living in the deserts of Namibia, the mountains of Mongolia, or the scrubland outside a village in Israel is an entirely different kind of problem, and reading between the lines of how this research actually unfolded, it is hard not to smile a little at what that fieldwork must have actually looked like. Somewhere in the collecting of nearly 1,000 samples, there was almost certainly at least one very undignified afternoon involving a net, a very angry animal, and a scientist explaining not for the first time that this was all in the name of science. The particular kind of genetic material his team focused on was mitochondrial DNA, a small separate strand of genetic code passed down almost unchanged from mother to offspring, generation after generation bypassing the father's genetic contribution entirely, Because it mutates only very slowly and rarely mitochondrial DNA behaves a little like a family name passed unbroken down a maternal line for thousands of years. Trace it carefully enough across enough individual cats, and you can follow a modern house cat's ancestry backward through countless generations of mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers, all the way to whichever wild population first gave rise to the entire line. Driscoll's team, working alongside colleagues at the University of Oxford, focused their comparison on 5 separate wildcat populations, scattered across different corners of the world, 1 native to Europe, 1 to China, 1 to Central Asia, 1 to Southern Africa, and 1 to the Middle East. On paper, any one of these 5 could plausibly have been the ancestor of the cat curled up in your own home tonight. Wildcats of one kind or another have lived alongside human settlements on nearly every inhabited continent for tens of thousands of years. If domestication really does come down to opportunity and proximity, as much of this story has suggested so far, then it should have happened more than once in more than one place involving more than one of these 5 populations. That is not what the genetic record showed. Every single domestic cat sampled, no matter which continent it currently called home, no matter how many generations its family had lived far from the Middle East, traced its ancestry back to exactly one of those 5 populations, the Middle Eastern wildcat, the very same striped sandy-coloured hunter we have been following through this entire story. Not the European wildcat, not the wildcats of China, Central Asia, or Southern Africa, all of which had just as many centuries of proximity to human settlements to work with. One population in one region appears to have produced every house cat now living on every continent on Earth. Sit with that for a moment. What made this particular population out of every wildcat lineage scattered across the ancient world the one exception? Was there something written into their behaviour that made them uniquely suited to tolerate people? Something in the surrounding landscape of the Fertile Crescent itself that pushed this specific population toward human settlements harder than any other wildcat population elsewhere was ever pushed? Or was it once again simply a matter of timing this particular population happening to sit exactly where the first grain stores of human history were being built? It is worth remembering for a moment just how many other opportunities history handed out. Wildcats in China lived beside rice farmers for thousands of years. Wildcats in southern Africa lived beside herding communities for just as long. European wildcats prowled the same forests as early farming villages across the continent for millennia. Every one of those populations had rodents nearby. Every one of them had some kind of proximity to human settlement sooner or later. And yet none of them produced a single lasting lineage of house cats. Only one population in one region, at one particular moment in early human history, actually crossed that threshold and stayed on the other side of it. Some researchers lean toward the idea that something truly distinctive sat within this Middle Eastern wildcat population itself, a subtle variation in temperament that made the boldest individuals slightly more willing to tolerate risk than their cousins on other continents. Others argue the honest answer has less to do with the cats and more to do with human beings. The Fertile Crescent was where farming itself was invented, which meant grain stores and the rodent explosions that came with them existed there first and existed nowhere else on Earth for a very long stretch of early human history. By the time farming eventually spread to other regions and other wildcat populations encountered their own local grain stores, the Middle Eastern cat had already claimed the role. There was no second opening left for a European or Central Asian wildcat to fill. Maybe it was something written into her blood, some faint genetic head, start toward boldness that no other wildcat population happened to share. Maybe it was pure geographic timing, one population simply arriving first to an opportunity that would never repeat itself the same way twice. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest answer of all, both of those forces were pulling in the exact same direction at once, and trying to separate them and now, 10,000 years later, is a little like trying to work out which particular raindrop started a flood. One region, one population, every cat alive. There is a second layer to what Driscoll's research uncovered, and it might be the more surprising half of the story. Within that single Middle Eastern wildcat population, the genetic data did not point to one single founding mother, one dramatic original cat from whom every house cat descends in a neat single line. Instead, researchers identified at least 5 separate maternal lineages, meaning 5 different family groups of wildcats, likely scattered across different villages and different corners of the same broad region, each independently drifting toward the same relationship with humans around the same general window of time. This detail matters more than it might sound like at first. It means the bond between cats and humans was never a single event. There was no one dramatic afternoon when the first cat was tamed, no founding legend, no single village that can claim to be the true birthplace of the house cat. It happened many times in many places by many different family groups of cats, all independently arriving at the exact same conclusion within a few hundred years of one another. It was less an invention than it was in a strange way a trend, an idea that seemed to occur to an entire species at almost the same moment, spreading not through one act of taming, but through dozens of quiet, unconnected decisions made by individual animals across an entire region. There is something almost comforting in that detail if you think about it long enough. This was never one clever cat who happened to get lucky, some ancient feline celebrity whose bold choice the rest of the species simply inherited by accident. It was closer to a quiet, shared instinct rippling outward through an entire population at once, as though something about that particular moment in history was simply ready to be crossed by whichever cats happened to be standing closest to the threshold when it opened. Before we keep going, take a moment to notice how your body feels right now wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. Let your jaw unclench if it has been holding any tension. Let your hands go loose. There is nowhere you need to be but exactly where you already are. Here is where the deeper meaning behind the title of this entire story starts to come into focus. When scientists study truly domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, horses, and especially dogs, they can usually find clear fingerprints left behind by generations of deliberate human breeding. Concentrated changes clustered around specific genes, tied to digestion, temperament, trainability, or physical traits that a breeder was actively selecting for generation after generation on purpose. A dog's genome carries the unmistakable signature of thousands of years spent under direct human control, shaped deliberately into everything from a 5-pound lapdog to a 150-pound guardian. All of it steered by human hands, choosing which animal got to breed with which. The domestic cat's genome carries almost none of that signature. Compared to her wild ancestor, she is genetically speaking remarkably unchanged. Researchers who have compared the two side by side consistently find far fewer signs of deliberate selection than in nearly any other animal humans consider domesticated. It is not that nothing changed at all. A handful of genetic differences mostly connected to fear response and reward-seeking behavior do separate today's house cat from her wild ancestor. But compared to the sweeping genetic overhaul visible in a dog's DNA, it amounts to barely a whisper of alteration. Take one well-documented example of exactly the kind of change a cat never went through. Dogs living alongside early farming communities gradually developed extra copies of a particular gene that helps digest starch and adaptation, almost certainly driven by countless generations of eating scraps from an increasingly grain-heavy human diet. Wolves do not carry this same genetic advantage. Dogs over thousands of years spent living on human leftovers quietly evolved a digestive system reshaped around a human dinner table. Cats show nothing comparable. She remains to this day what biologists call an obligate carnivore, an animal whose body still requires a diet built almost entirely around meat to survive exactly as her wild ancestor did 10,000 years ago, seemingly unmoved by 10,000 years spent living beside people who mostly eat bread. This is what makes the title of tonight's chapter something more than clever wordplay. A domestication with no domesticator. Nobody bred her. Nobody selected her for temperament, for size, for loyalty, or for anything else not for thousands of years after this relationship began. She simply showed up, tolerated us just enough to survive comfortably nearby, and passed that same faint tolerance down to her kittens over and over for roughly 10,000 years, almost entirely on her own terms. If you have ever heard someone describe cats as only partly tame, this is the real scientific weight behind that claim, not an opinion about temperament, but a measurable fact written directly into her DNA. It also explains something you may have noticed yourself if there happens to be an outdoor cat population anywhere near you. Feral cats, cats born and raised with no human contact at all, do not need months of careful training to survive in the wild. They simply revert almost instantly to hunting, territory marking, and total self-sufficiency, because none of that ever actually left their genetic toolkit in the first place. A dog abandoned in the wild struggles enormously to survive on its own because thousands of years of deliberate breeding steered it away from the skill set a wolf still carries. A cat abandoned the same way is often hunting successfully within days. She was never that far from her wild ancestor to begin with. Here is a question worth turning over as we head toward the end of this chapter tonight. If nobody was actively taming her, if no single event or single village started this story, and if her genetics barely changed at all, then what exactly are we even describing when we use the word domestication for a relationship built this loosely, this gradually, and this far outside anyone's actual control? Maybe domestication was never really the right word for what happened here at all. Maybe something closer to an ongoing unfinished negotiation captures it better, one that started roughly 10,000 years ago in a scatter of Middle Eastern villages and has in a very real sense never fully concluded. Or maybe the honest answer is that we simply borrowed a word built for cattle and horses and applied it to an animal who never quite agreed to the same terms. There is a small, quiet thought worth carrying with you tonight, especially if there happens to be a cat asleep somewhere nearby right now. She's not a blank slate that you or generations of breeders before you carefully built from nothing into a household companion. Genetically, she is standing remarkably near where her ancestor stood in that desert we visited, at the very start of this story, carrying nearly the same instincts, nearly the same capabilities, nearly the same quiet capacity for total self-sufficiency. She is not living with you because thousands of years of human effort finally domesticated the wildness out of her. She is living with you because roughly 10,000 years ago an ancestor of hers ran a private calculation of her own, decided the arrangement was worth it, and every single generation since has in its own small way kept renewing that same decision. Whatever we choose to call it, that loose, quietly self-directed relationship was about to walk straight into the one civilization on Earth that would take it and build an entire religion around it. A civilization that would decide this particular animal was not simply useful and not simply tolerated, but sacred enough that harming one could cost a person their life. A civilization does not build a temple to an animal overnight. Long before any single cat was ever carved into stone as a goddess, the species had to travel first quietly, riding along inside caravans, trade routes, and migrating farming communities decade after decade, picking up new meanings in every new place it landed. Egypt did not invent the idea that a cat might matter. Egypt simply took an idea that had already been circulating for thousands of years and turned the volume all the way up. Picture a mud brick home in a city near the Euphrates River somewhere around 3,500 years ago in the heart of what we now call Mesopotamia. The evening air smells faintly of river silt and lamp oil. Inside, a woman sits with a wax writing board balanced on her knee. the kind scribes and merchants used for quick everyday notes, a stylus resting loosely between her fingers. A cat, half-grown and clearly pleased with herself, has just leapt onto the low table beside the oil lamp, sending a small clay cup rattling against the packed earth floor. In most households in most centuries that would simply be an annoyance, the kind of small domestic chaos every cat owner recognizes instantly. In this household, in this particular century, it was something worth taking seriously. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, a civilization famous for astrology, dream interpretation, and reading the future in the entrails of sacrificed animals, even the behavior of an ordinary house cat did not go unnoticed. Scholars and priests compiled enormous collections of omens, long lists cataloguing which everyday events predicted good fortune and which predicted disaster, and cats earned their own dedicated section within one of the largest of these collections, a sprawling text scholars today refer to as Shuma Alu. These were not casual notes scratched onto scrap material. They were pressed carefully into wet clay, with a wedge-shaped stylus tablet after tablet, then fired or dried and stored in temple archives, treated with the same seriousness as legal contracts or royal decrees. A cat jumping onto a particular piece of furniture, a cat behaving strangely near the household shrine. Even, and this is the detail that tends to make modern audiences laugh out loud, a cat relieving itself on a person, which several tablets record not as an insult but as a sign of coming good luck. If you've ever laughed at your own cat doing something ridiculous and half-joked that it must mean something, you are, whether you realized it or not, participating in a tradition that is roughly 3,500 years old. It helps to understand why a civilization like this one paid such careful attention to something as small as a cat jumping onto a table in the first place. Mesopotamian scholars believe the world was in a very real sense constantly speaking to them through the flight paths of birds, the markings on a sheep's liver pulled fresh from a sacrifice, the patterned smoke made rising from a fire, even the shapes formed by oil poured onto water. Nothing was considered too small or too ordinary to carry a hidden message if you knew how to interpret it correctly. Cats sharing every household's most private, unguarded moments simply became one more voice in an enormous chorus of everyday signs that an entire civilization had trained itself to listen for. Dogs earned their own sections in these same omen collections. So did birds, snakes, and the behavior of livestock in the field. The cat was not singled out for special treatment here. She was simply one contributor among many to an entire worldview built around paying attention. Here is where the story gets truly interesting, though, and not in the direction you might expect. Given how seriously Mesopotamian scholars took these omens, you might assume cats held something near sacred status across the entire region, temples built in their honor, priesthoods devoted to their care. That is not what the historical record shows. Compared to the flood of surviving art, poetry, and religious texts built around lions in Mesopotamian culture, guardian statues, royal symbols, terrifying descriptions in epic poetry, cats appear only in scattered, modest fragments. Notice, certainly. Worth writing down, apparently, but nowhere near worshipped. So here is a question worth turning over for a moment. Why would a civilization this obsessed with omens, this willing to build entire scholarly traditions around the meaning of a bird's flight path or the shape of a sheep's liver, stop short of turning the cat into something truly divine? Some historians argue the answer sits in simple competition for symbolic space. Mesopotamian religion had already claimed the lion as its dominant feline symbol, a creature associated with kings, with war goddesses, with raw and terrifying power. Centuries before, the domestic cat had spread widely enough to become a familiar sight in most homes. There was, in a sense, no vacancy left at the top of the feline hierarchy by the time cats arrived in real numbers. Others suggest something more practical. Cats may simply not have reached a large enough, visible enough population across Mesopotamian cities during this earlier period to command the kind of cultural weight lions, cattle, and other animals with deeper religious roots already carried. A newcomer, no matter how useful, does not always get invited straight to the head of the table. Maybe the lion had already claimed the throne, leaving no room for a smaller cousin to climb any higher. Maybe cats simply had not yet spread far enough in large enough numbers to earn that kind of collective devotion. Or maybe, and this feels like the quieter, more honest answer, sacred status was never really something a species earns through usefulness alone. It takes a particular civilization in a particular moment deciding to look at an animal and see something more than a pest controller. Mesopotamia noticed. Mesopotamia just was not the civilization that would end up making that leap. Not yet. There is something worth noticing about this specific brand of attention, something that reaches beyond ancient Mesopotamia alone. Long before formal science existed to explain animal behavior, people in scattered, unconnected cultures seem to have shared the same basic impulse watch, closely enough, and the creatures living alongside you start to feel like they are trying to tell you something. That instinct shows up today too in far less formal ways. People still swear their dog senses a storm coming before the first cloud appears. People still insist their cat seems to notice when something in the house feels wrong hours before any person catches on. Whatever filled those Mesopotamian clay tablets never really disappeared. It just stopped being official scholarship and quietly became the kind of thing people say to each other instead, half joking, half not. While all of this was unfolding in the cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, something else quieter and less documented was happening on a much wider scale. As farming itself continued spreading outward from its original heartland in the Fertile Crescent, carried along by generations of migrating and trading communities, cats appear to have travelled with it almost as a fixed part of the package. Wherever wheat and barley went, wherever mud-brick villages sprang up along expanding trade networks, cat bones seemed to follow, turning up in the archaeological record at greater and greater distances from where this entire story first began. By roughly 4,000 years ago, cat remains consistent with early domestic populations were already turning up as far east as the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan, a civilization known for sophisticated cities, standardized weights and measures, and trade networks stretching all the way back toward Mesopotamia itself. Think about the distance involved here for a moment. From the hill villages of the Fertile Crescent to the urban centers of the Indus Valley is roughly the same stretch of geography separating New York from the western edge of the United States. No airplanes, no highways, just centuries of caravans, river routes, and foot traffic carrying grain pottery styles, metalwork, and apparently cats slowly eastward across an entire continent. Picture what one leg of that journey might have actually looked like. A line of pack donkeys moving slowly along a dry riverbed, traders wrapped against the daytime heat sacks of grain, and bundled textiles swaying with every step. Somewhere among the cargo, tucked into whatever shade the caravan could offer, during the worst of the afternoon sun, a cat rides along, earning her place the same way she always had, by keeping the grain sacks free of exactly the kind of rodents that could ruin an entire shipment days from the nearest town. Nobody sang songs about her contribution. Nobody carved her portrait into a trade ledger. She simply did the work mile after mile, the same quiet job her ancestors had been doing since the very first grain basket, back in the Fertile Crescent, just carried out now aboard a mode of transportation her wild ancestor could never have imagined needing. It is worth resisting a tempting but almost certainly wrong assumption here that these cats simply wandered there on their own, following food from village to village under their own initiative with no real human involvement at all. Long-distance trade routes of this era were demanding deliberate undertakings, carefully provisioned and carefully planned. A merchant caravan crossing hundreds of miles of open country needed every advantage it could get against exactly the kind of rodent infestation that had first drawn cats toward human grain stores thousands of years earlier. It is far more likely that cats rode along as working members of these caravans in their own right, valued enough to feed and protect across a truly difficult journey, rather than simply trailing behind out of curiosity. Why would a trade caravan already stretch thin feeding pack animals and human travellers across days or weeks of difficult terrain bother provisioning a cat as well? What made that particular arithmetic so obviously worth it? A single spoiled grain sack ruined by rats halfway through a long desert crossing could mean the difference between a profitable trip and a devastating loss. A good working cat feeding herself largely off the very rodents she was there to control cost a merchant almost nothing extra to bring along. The economics in the end were remarkably simple. Cheap insurance against catastrophic loss in a form that also happened to curl up and sleep soundly the moment the day's danger had passed. In other words, the cat was not just spreading. She was being carried deliberately as cargo worth the trouble riding the same trade routes that carried tin lapis lazuli and grain between two of the ancient world's great civilizations. There is something worth sitting with in that image for a moment, an animal who only a few thousand years earlier wanted absolutely nothing to do with people, now travelling as a trusted, protected member of trade expeditions crossing an entire continent. Practical utility had by this point curdled into something closer to genuine reliance. Merchants were not simply tolerating an animal that happened to be nearby anymore. They were actively planning around her presence the same way they planned around water supplies or pack animals. It is a strange kind of achievement when you think about it for an animal that never once asked to be included in any of it. She didn't campaign for a place on that caravan. She didn't demonstrate loyalty the way a working dog might, learning commands, guarding a camp, earning her keep through visible devotion. She simply kept doing the one thing she had always done, hunting rodents with total competence, and let the value of that single skill quietly carry her from a scattered handful of fertile crescent villages all the way to the edge of South Asia. Sometimes the longest journeys are not won through effort to belong. They are won by simply continuing to be useful and letting the rest of the world slowly rearrange itself around that usefulness. Before we continue, let yourself notice for just a moment how heavy your eyelids have become. If they have already fallen shut, that is exactly as it should be. This is not a story that needs your full attention to still reach you. Wherever you are tonight, whatever corner of the world you have settled into, know that this same quiet story is drifting into countless other rooms at this exact same hour, each one just as still as yours. If you remember the fragments of ancient artwork we touched on earlier in this journey, engravings and painted pottery from roughly 10,000 years ago, already showing cats placed deliberately at the centre of a scene, rather than tucked quietly into the background, you can start to see a slow, patient thread connecting all of it together. From the very first villages of the Fertile Crescent, through the omen tablets of Mesopotamia, through the trade caravans crossing toward the Indus Valley, a pattern keeps repeating itself in different forms across different cultures. Humans noticing this particular animal again and again, and deciding in ways large and small that she was worth paying attention to. None of it on its own quite adds up to worship. A jump interpreted as an omen is not a temple. A cat riding along a trade route is not a goddess. But layer enough of these small, scattered moments of attention on top of one another, spread out across enough centuries and enough separate cultures, and you start to see the outline of something building slowly and unevenly toward an inevitable tipping point. All that was missing was one civilization willing to take that quiet accumulated attention and turn it into something absolute. Follow the trade routes far enough south and west from Mesopotamia, past the coastline, past the last scattered villages of the Levant, and the land eventually opens onto a river unlike any other in the ancient world, a slow, generous green ribbon cutting through an otherwise merciless desert, flooding every single year with a predictability the rest of the ancient world could only envy. Along its banks, farmers did not fear the harvest, the way farmers elsewhere so often did. The river gave reliably, almost gently, year after year, and the civilization that grew up trusting that gift would come to see the entire natural world through a very different lens than the anxious omen-reading scholars of Mesopotamia ever had. A civilization was rising here that would not simply notice the cat or trade with the cat, or write down what her behavior might predict about tomorrow's harvest. A civilization that would kneel. The Nile does not simply flood. It arrives every single year with a patience the rest of the ancient world could only dream about, swallowing the desert's edge and leaving behind a dark, generous silt that turned the surrounding valley into some of the richest farmland anywhere on Earth. A civilization raised on that kind of yearly abundance tends to see the world differently than one constantly bracing for famine, and somewhere in that difference lies the beginning of why Egypt, more than any culture before it, was ready to look at an ordinary cat and see something closer to a god. Step inside a modest home along the Nile somewhere around 3,000 years ago. The heat of the afternoon has settled into the mud brick walls, and a cat lies curled in a patch of sun near the household shrine, a thin gold band fastened around one ear catching the light every time she shifts position. She has just been fed generously from the same dish the family itself ate from that morning, fish and bread set down without a second thought. This was not an unusual sight. Wealthier Egyptian households routinely dressed their cats in jewellery and fed them well beyond what any working Mauser strictly needed, treating her less like staff and more like a cherished, slightly demanding relative who happened to have 4 legs and a tail. The Greek historian Herodotus, travelling through Egypt centuries later and clearly fascinated by what he witnessed, recorded one detail that tells you almost everything you need to know about where cats stood in the Egyptian household. It is worth knowing briefly who this witness actually was. Herodotus wrote several centuries after many of Egypt's most striking cat customs had already taken root, travelling through the country as an outsider, with a taste for the dramatic and the strange, which means historians today approach his accounts with real interest, but also real caution, checking his claims wherever possible against archaeology, temple inscriptions, and other independent sources rather than accepting them at face value. Where his account lines up with the physical evidence as it largely does here, it earns our trust. Where it stands alone, it earns our healthy skepticism instead. When a fire broke out in a home, he wrote, the family's first instinct was not to save their belongings, or even necessarily to fight the flames. It was to save the cats. People would stand at the edges of a burning building he claimed forming a human barrier, not to keep looters out, but to stop any cat inside from panicking and dashing back into the fire. Whether every single household behaved exactly this way is impossible to confirm from a single Greek visitor's account, but the fact that Herodotus considered it worth writing down at all tells you how strange, how truly remarkable this level of devotion looked to an outsider raised in a culture where cats were still at best useful and tolerated. When a household cat did die, the family's grief was not quiet or private. Egyptian sources describe mourners shaving off their own eyebrows as a visible sign of loss, continuing the display of mourning until the eyebrows grew back in on their own, weeks later a walking, very public reminder to the entire neighbourhood of exactly how much that particular cat had meant. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. What kind of civilization builds an entire visible ritual of public grief around losing a pet? We do something similar today in our own quieter ways. Memorial posts, paw print, keepsakes, small stones in a garden. But shaving your own face on purpose so that every person you meet for weeks afterward would ask what happened and you would have to say her name out loud again is a different order of public devotion entirely. It turns private grief into something the whole street has to witness and acknowledge, whether they want to or not. This was only the gentlest edge of how seriously Egypt took its cats, though. The far sharper edge belonged to the law. Around 59 years before the Common Era, A Roman official visiting Egypt made a mistake that would prove fatal, and not because of anything resembling treason or scandal. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, the man killed a cat. Whether by accident or simple carelessness, the record does not make entirely clear. Word spread through the surrounding streets almost instantly. A crowd gathered, then grew, then turned openly violent, and by the time it was over, the Roman was dead, torn apart by an enraged mob that no amount of diplomatic status could protect him from. The ruling pharaoh at the time, according to the account, tried to intervene on the man's behalf, sending word that the visitor should be spared, that Rome, after all, was not an ally worth casually offending. It did not matter. Messengers arrived too late or were simply ignored by a crowd that had already decided what justice looked like. The crowd's fury over the dead cat outweighed even the political risk of enraging an empire that within a generation would swallow Egypt whole. Think about what that actually tells you. This was not simply cultural sensitivity, the kind of thing a foreign visitor might be gently warned about before their trip. This was a legal and social reality serious enough that an entire government, at the height of its diplomatic caution toward Rome, could not save one careless man's life once a cat's death was involved. The protection did not stop at Egypt's borders either. Cats, it seems, were considered far too valuable, far too sacred to simply let leave the country. Court records from this period describe attempts to smuggle cats out of Egypt. Small groups of soldiers dispatched specifically to intercept caravans, suspected of carrying stolen animals, treating a stolen cat with something near the seriousness of stolen state property. Merchants attempting to slip a favourite cat aboard a departing ship, or hide one among ordinary cargo bound for Greece or the Levant, risk far more than a simple fine if caught. If you have ever wondered just how tightly a government could regulate a single species of animal, Egypt's export restrictions on the common house cat may be one of the strangest, most thorough examples in the ancient world. Why go to such extremes? A death penalty is one thing. A dedicated smuggling watch soldiers actively hunting down stolen cats at the border is a different level of institutional commitment entirely. Some historians point to simple economics dressed up in religious language. If cats were understood as living vessels of a goddess's presence, then losing enough of them to smuggling could in theory threaten the spiritual security of the entire nation, a risk no ruler wanted to be blamed for allowing. Others suggest something closer to the opposite explanation, that the religious framework came second, and what Egypt was really protecting was a practical economic monopoly, since a healthy population of skilled mousers guarding the nation's grain stores, the true foundation of Egyptian wealth and stability, was simply too valuable to risk exporting to potential rivals. Perhaps the truth once again refuses to sit neatly in only one of those two boxes. A government rarely needs to choose between piety and self-interest, when both happen to point toward exactly the same policy. If you have ever noticed how convenient it often is when a society's deepest religious convictions also happen to protect its most valuable economic resource, you have already spotted the pattern running underneath most of ancient history, Egypt very much included. Take a slow breath here before we continue. Wherever you are lying tonight, let your legs go heavy against the mattress one at a time, starting with whichever foot feels most tired. There is no test at the end of this, nothing to remember, just this voice and whatever is left of the evening. All of this reverence found its loudest, most public expression once a year at the city of Bubastis, home to Bastet's grandest temple. Herodotus described the scene firsthand, and it was nothing like the hushed, solemn religious ceremony you might picture. Pilgrims travelled by boat down the Nile in staggering numbers, by some ancient estimates well over 500,000 people, converging on a single city for the occasion. River traffic packed so tightly that boats scraped against one another for miles before ever reaching the docks. Music played constantly along the riverbanks, flutes and hand drums competing with singing that carried clear across the water. Wine flowed freely by every account in truly enormous quantities. Herodotus specifically noted that more wine was consumed during this single annual festival than during the entire rest of the year combined. Women aboard the passing boats shouted, danced, and called out to villagers along the shore as they passed, lifting their skirts and jeering playfully at bystanders in a display Herodotus clearly found startling enough to record in detail an atmosphere closer to a raucous countrywide carnival than a solemn religious rite. It is worth letting that image sit for a moment because it complicates the picture most people carry around of ancient Egyptian religion, all still statues and silent temples. The worship of Bastet at its yearly peak looked considerably more like a joyful, half-chaotic celebration than a hushed act of piety. Reverence and celebration, it turns out, were never actually opposites in Egyptian religious life. They were simply two expressions of the exact same devotion. It is worth pausing here to notice just how sharp a turn this represents. Travel back along the very trade routes we followed earlier in this story into the cities of Mesopotamia, and cats were noticed, catalogued, written into omen tablets, alongside dogs and birds and livestock, but never elevated much beyond that. The lion had already claimed the region's throne of feline symbolism, leaving no obvious room at the top for a smaller cousin. Egypt, arriving at its own relationship with the cat along an entirely separate cultural path, made no such concession. Here the cat did not have to share the throne with anyone. She simply became the throne. There is a harder truth sitting underneath all of this reverence, though, and it deserves honest attention rather than a comfortable skip. Egyptian temples did not rely purely on household cats living out natural lives before eventual mummification. Archaeological evidence from cat cemeteries across Egypt shows large numbers of kittens, many under a year old, deliberately bred at temple catteries specifically for the mummification trade, killed at a young age and sold to pilgrims as votive offerings meant to carry a prayer up to the goddess herself. A pilgrim arriving at Bubastis without the means to commission an elaborate offering could instead purchase a small mummified kitten from the temple's own stock wrap, a private wish or request inside the transaction, and leave it as a gift meant to reach Bastet directly. It is an uncomfortable detail to hold alongside the eyebrow-shaving mourners and the mob that killed a man over a single cat's life, and it is worth resisting the urge to smooth that contradiction away. Egypt could truly revere the cat as sacred and simultaneously run a large-scale religious industry that treated individual cats as replaceable mass-produced offerings. Both were true at once, and history rarely offers us the tidy single-note version we might prefer. There is one final piece of this story worth carrying with you, a strange, almost unbelievable coda that arrived roughly 3,000 years after Bastet's temples first rose along the Nile. In 1888, an Egyptian farmer digging near the town of Beni Hassan broke into an enormous underground cat cemetery, tens of thousands of mummified cats packed together in the sand layer upon layer, undisturbed for millennia, some still perfectly wrapped, others crumbled into little more than fur and bone dust. Local villagers descended on the site within days. Children picked through the loose sand for the best preserved specimens, selling them for a few coins to curious travellers passing along the river road. Word of the discovery spread quickly, though not this time toward reverence. Local entrepreneurs saw the sheer quantity involved and made a purely commercial decision. Roughly 180,000 mummified cats weighing nearly 20 tons were shipped across the sea to Liverpool, England in early 1890 and sold at public auction, ground up and spread across British farmland as fertiliser. At one particularly memorable sale, the auctioneer reportedly used an actual cat skull as his auction hammer, banging it against the podium to call for bids on the very same lot it had come from. Sit with that image for just a moment, because it is truly difficult to invent a sharper piece of irony than this one. Animals once considered so sacred that killing even one could cost a foreign diplomat his life, Animals mummified with the same careful ritual once reserved for pharaohs ended up 3,000 years later, tilled into English soil to help grow that century's turnips and wheat. It is not a cruel joke. History is playing so much as an honest reminder nothing, no matter how sacred it once seemed to the people who built it, is guaranteed to stay that way forever in the eyes of whoever comes next. Egypt's devotion to the cat, though extraordinary as it was, did not stay contained within Egypt's own borders for long. Ships were already leaving Egyptian harbours loaded with grain, linen and goods, bound for the wider Mediterranean world, and somewhere among that cargo, quietly, almost as an afterthought, travelled the animal an entire civilization had just spent centuries turning into something near divine. A goddess, it turns out, does not stay confined to a single set of temples once the ship starts sailing. She goes wherever the trade winds happen to carry her, whether the people receiving her on the other end have any idea what they're about to welcome aboard. A river only carries you so far. To cross an entire continent, an animal built for solitary desert hunting needed something considerably larger than a trade caravan or a single grateful farming village. She needed an empire won with roads paved well enough to survive 2,000 years of weather ships, numerous enough to touch every coastline of the Mediterranean, and soldiers stubborn enough to carry their comforts with them to the very edge of the known world. Picture a small wooden fort near the northern edge of Roman Britain, somewhere near the line that would eventually become Hadrian's Wall sometime in the 2nd century. Cold air cuts across the hillside with none of the gentleness of the Nile Valley or the warmth of the Mediterranean coast these soldiers left behind. Inside the granary building, sacks of grain shipped up from the south, sight stacked against a stone wall, the lifeblood of an entire garrison, stationed at the far, cold rim of an empire that stretched almost impossibly far from home. And curled on top of one of those sacks, thoroughly unbothered by the cold air rattling the shutters, outside a cat sleeps through the afternoon, having already done her job for the day. She has travelled farther from her ancestors' desert than almost any animal in her family line ever had, farther than the wildcat who first approached a Fertile Crescent grain store, farther even than the cats who rode caravans toward the Indus Valley centuries earlier. She arrived here the same way thousands of others like her didn't, wandering on her own initiative across an entire continent, but carried deliberately aboard Roman supply ships and military convoys valued for exactly the same skill that had opened every door for her kind since the very beginning of this story. Somewhere south of her, similar cats are doing the exact same job in forts along the Rhine and the Danube, in warehouses in Gaul, in the busy port cities ringing the entire Mediterranean coastline. Wherever the empire built a road, a granary or a garrison, a cat was rarely far behind. For a long stretch of the 20th century, historians assumed cats had been trickling into Europe gradually for thousands of years, drifting north alongside the slow spread of farming itself, arriving with the very first Neolithic settlers who brought wheat and barley into the continent's interior. Recent genetic research has quietly overturned that assumption, and the correction is worth sitting with for a moment because it changes the shape of this entire chapter. Scientists studying the ancient DNA of cat remains recovered from archaeological sites scattered across Europe and Turkey. Dozens of samples spanning more than 10,000 years of feline history found something unexpected. Researchers compared the genetic code preserved in bones ranging from the earliest Neolithic sites all the way through to remains only a few centuries old, tracking exactly when and where each genetic lineage first appears. The particular genetic lineage carried by nearly every cat alive in Europe today does not stretch back to those early Neolithic farmers at all. It only appears in the genetic record roughly 2,000 years ago, arriving abruptly at scale at almost exactly the moment the Roman Empire was expanding its road network, its shipping lanes and its military presence across the entire continent. So here is a question worth turning over for a moment. If cats had already been drifting into Europe for thousands of years before Rome ever existed, Where did all of those earlier cats go? Did none of them leave descendants at all? The honest answer researchers have settled on is more interesting than a simple correction. Small scattered populations of cats likely had reached parts of Europe earlier, trickling in slowly the old way, following farming villages north over many centuries. But those early populations appear to have remained thin, isolated and genetically unremarkable small pockets here and there, rather than anything resembling a continent-wide presence easily lost to local extinction, interbreeding, or simple bad luck over the centuries. It took something considerably larger than gradual farming drift to actually flood Europe with cats in numbers big enough to leave a lasting genetic signature. It took an empire with the infrastructure to move animals, goods and people at a scale and a speed nothing before it had ever managed repeatedly reliably along the same well-maintained routes year after year for centuries on end. A few scattered farmers carrying a cat north once in a generation could never compete with a professional shipping network moving grain soldiers and livestock along the same roads on a fixed, endlessly repeating schedule. Rome's reach for this particular animal stretched considerably further than Europe alone too. Along the Red Sea coast at a Roman trading port called Myos Hormos, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a cat deliberately buried inside an administrative building dated to roughly the 1st or 2nd century, at a site that connected Roman Egypt to trade routes reaching all the way toward India. Wherever Roman commerce went, in other words, this particular passenger appears to have gone along with it, patrolling warehouses stocked with spices and cloth as readily as she patrolled a British granary stacked with northern grain. Rome did not simply tolerate this spread. In its own particular way, it fueled it. Wherever you are tonight, let your weight settle a little further into whatever is holding you up. There is no need to follow every detail from here. Let some of these words simply wash past you, if your eyes have already grown too heavy to keep open. Interestingly, cats were not even Rome's first choice for the job. Throughout the earlier centuries of the Republic, Roman households commonly kept weasels and martens as semi-tame pest controllers, small sharp-toothed creatures tolerated indoors specifically to keep rodent populations in check around stored food. It was only from around the 1st century onward that cats began steadily replacing them in Roman homes, and the reasons were not purely practical. Cats proved more effective hunters, certainly quieter, cleaner, and considerably less prone to nipping the hand that fed them than a half-wild weasel ever was. But Roman households also seem to have simply preferred having them around. They were by most accounts better company, more affectionate, more strikingly beautiful, and for wealthier families eager to display a bit of exotic flair, owning one carried a certain fashionable prestige that a native household weasel never quite managed. If you've ever upgraded to a nicer version of something purely functional, only to discover you also just enjoy having the nicer version around you, have more in common with a 2nd century Roman household than you might expect. Roman farming manuals from this period even offer surprisingly practical, almost comically mundane advice about living alongside cats. The kind of detail that makes these ancient households feel suddenly disarmingly familiar. One agricultural writer recommended plastering the inside walls of a duck enclosure, smooth specifically to keep resourceful cats from climbing in after the birds, while noting elsewhere that a cat around the property was on balance, a clear benefit. She would not touch stored grain. She buried her own waste tidily out of the way, and she kept the vermin population honest, without requiring any wages, training or supervision whatsoever. It is in its own dry, practical way one of the oldest surviving character references a cat has ever received, and it still holds up remarkably well 2,000 years later. Rome gave the cat something else too. Something Egypt, for all its temples and mummies, never quite offered her, a symbolic identity built not around worship, but around an idea. The Romans associated the cat with Libertas, their goddess of liberty and personal freedom, whose temple stood on the Aventine Hill. Statues of Libertas were sometimes shown with a cat resting at her feet, watchful and unbothered, a detail rooted in a very simple, very Roman observation about feline character. A dog could be trained, commanded, made obedient through discipline and reward. A cat stubbornly famously could not. She would tolerate a household. She would rarely truly submit to one. Roman writers even coined a phrase for it: liberty without labour, capturing something Roman citizens clearly admired about an animal that seemed to carry its independence as a permanent non-negotiable condition, rather than a privilege granted by someone else. There is something worth noticing in that contrast. Egypt looked at this same animal and saw a living vessel for the divine something to kneel before. Rome looked at the very same creature and saw an entire philosophy of personal liberty walking around on 4 legs. Neither civilization was wrong exactly. They were simply each looking at her through the lens of whatever their own culture already valued most, one through devotion, the other through independence, and finding in the same stubborn, self-possessed animal a mirror for both. Nowhere does the physical, tangible reality of Roman cat ownership survive more vividly than in the ash of Pompeii. Wealthy households there commissioned detailed mosaics depicting cats in exactly the kind of unguarded domestic moments any modern cat owner would recognize instantly. One famous floor from the House of the Fawn shows a spotted, long-haired cat gripping a bird by the throat, its body coiled with satisfaction, a scattering of fish shellfish and other doomed creatures arranged beneath it, rendered in careful, colourful stone with the kind of artistic attention usually reserved for far grander subjects than a household hunter caught mid-triumph. And yet when archaeologists excavated the site buried by Vesuvius in the year 79, they found remarkably few actual cat remains preserved among the extraordinary wealth of human canine and other animal casts recovered from the ash. Only scattered bones turned up, a couple in outlying vineyards, a partial skeleton near the Temple of Venus, nothing near what you might expect from a city clearly fond enough of cats to memorialize them in expensive floor mosaics. There is a reasonably simple explanation, and it says something rather moving about the animal we've been following this entire journey. Vesuvius did not erupt without warning. In the hours and days beforehand, the ground trembled repeatedly, small tremors building toward the catastrophe to come, tremors humans might dismiss, rationalize, or simply sleep through the way. People living near any long dormant mountain tend to reassure themselves that today is probably nothing unusual. A cat's senses do not offer that same comfortable margin for denial. Her hearing her balance the same finely tuned instincts that once let her ancestor detect a mouse shifting under dry leaves from 30 feet away in an open desert would have registered each tremor as an unmistakable urgent signal long before any human neighbor thought to worry. It is entirely plausible that most of Pompeii's cats simply left before the disaster fully arrived, slipping out of the city and into the surrounding countryside hours or days ahead of the very people who fed and housed them, following an instinct for danger that had kept her wild ancestors alive in the desert for tens of thousands of years, an instinct that had never actually left her, no matter how many mosaics and dinner scraps Rome had showered her with in the meantime. Not every cat made it out though, and one particular discovery from the ruins carries a weight worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Among the remains recovered from Pompeii, excavators found the skeleton of a woman, her arms curled protectively around the skeleton of a cat, as though in whatever final seconds remained to her ash filling the air and the roof already beginning to fail, she had chosen to hold on rather than let go. We will never know that woman's name, or whether the cat in her arms belonged to her at all, or was simply the nearest small frightened creature within reach when the ash began to fall. It hardly changes what the image tells us. 2,000 years after wolves had already forged their partnership with humanity through loyalty, obedience, and shared purpose, here was a cat, an animal, that had spent its entire relationship with our species answering to absolutely no one still worth holding on to at the very end of everything. Whatever this particular bond was built from, it was strong enough at least for one person on one unbearable morning to outweigh every instinct telling her to run. Rome's roads, its ports, its endless movement of soldiers and grain and goods had done exactly what no wandering village trade route ever fully managed on its own. It had planted this animal in nearly every corner of a continent, from British forts shivering under a northern chill to Mediterranean villas gleaming under southern sun from garrison towns along the Rhine, to trading posts on the Red Sea coast cementing her presence so thoroughly that nothing which came afterward would ever fully undo it. Within a few centuries there would be almost nowhere left in Rome's vast territory where a cat sleeping on a warm hearth was considered anything unusual at all. But an empire that size does not last forever, and neither does the religious order that empire happens to be built upon. Even as cats were settling comfortably into farmhouses and villas across the continent, something else was quietly spreading alongside Rome's roads and its legions, a new faith taking root in the very same cities that had once built temples to old gods and their favoured animals. That faith would eventually look at this same creature, so recently a symbol of liberty and a companion worth dying to protect, and begin asking a very different, far darker set of questions about exactly what she might really be. Faith has a way of outliving the empires that first carried it. Rome fell piece by piece over the course of a few exhausting centuries, but the religion that had been quietly spreading through its cities long survived the roads, the legions and the temples that once housed older gods. By the time Europe settled into what we now call the Middle Ages, that religion had become the single most powerful force shaping how an entire continent understood the world, including whether anyone intended it or not. The small, quiet hunter still curled up on farmhouse hearths from Britain to the Balkans. For the first several centuries of medieval Europe, very little about the cat's daily life had actually changed. She still earned her keep the same way she always had, guarding grain stores from the same relentless rodents that had first drawn her ancestor toward a fertile crescent village thousands of years earlier. Picture a stone farmhouse somewhere in the English countryside, smoke curling from a low chimney, a cat stretched across a windowsill in the thin afternoon light, entirely unremarkable, entirely welcome. A good working cat was valued highly enough that in parts of medieval Wales, legal records set her worth at roughly the same price as a full-grown sheep or an untrained farm dog, a serious sum for what most households would have considered an ordinary animal. Killing someone else's cat in some of these early medieval communities could actually leave you legally liable for the cost of replacing her, the same way damaging a neighbour's livestock might. Somewhere around the 12th century, though, a second, much darker current began running alongside that practical appreciation, and it did not replace the old view so much as grow up right beside it, twisting through the same towns and the same households until both attitudes, useful farmhand and suspected agent of evil, existed side by side in the very same medieval mind. If you want to trace exactly where that darker current first broke into official church history, the trail leads to a specific document issued on a specific day by a specific pope, and the real story behind it is stranger and considerably more human than the version that tends to circulate today. In June of the year 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a formal decree known as Vox in Rama, addressed to church leaders in Germany. The letter responded to reports from an inquisitor named Conrad von Marburg, a zealous, deeply feared investigator who claimed to have uncovered a secret heretical cult operating in the region around Mainz and Hildesheim. Conrad had built a fearsome reputation. One contemporary church official at the time even wrote directly to the Pope, warning that Conrad was forcing confessions out of innocent people by threatening them with burning at the stake if they refused to talk. According to Conrad's reports, which historians today treat with real suspicion, given that well-documented reliance on torture, this cult practiced an initiation ritual involving a mysterious pale figure, and near the ceremony's climax, a statue of a black cat that supposedly came to life walking backward with its tail raised to be kissed by each new member in turn. Here is where the popular version of this story tends to run ahead of what the actual document says. You may have heard some version of the claim that this papal letter ordered the mass killing of cats across Christendom, sparking a centuries-long extermination that directly caused the population explosion of rats behind the worst outbreak of plague in human history. It makes for a dramatic, satisfying piece of historical cause and effect. It is also not quite accurate. Read the actual text of Vox in Rama, and you will not find a single instruction to kill any cat anywhere. The letter is a condemnation of an alleged heretical sect and a call to root out that specific group through inquisition. The black cat described within it is a symbolic detail inside one very particular, very likely, exaggerated account of a secret ritual, not a blanket declaration about the nature of ordinary house cats sleeping in ordinary German farmhouses. Historians who have gone back to the original Latin text generally agree that Gregory's real target was heresy itself, not household pets. So here's a question worth sitting with for a moment because it says something interesting about how history actually spreads. If the original document never called for cats to be killed at all, why does that version of the story feel so widely accepted today? The honest answer is that big, tidy explanations tend to travel further than messy, gradual ones. A single dramatic villain, one pope, one decree, one clear moment where everything changed, makes for a far more shareable story than what actually seems to have happened, which was slower, more diffuse, and considerably harder to pin on any single person or document. Over the following 2 centuries, the association between black cats and the demonic crept steadily outward from documents like this one, absorbed into folk belief sermons and local superstition, gradually hardening into something far more widespread and far more dangerous than anything Gregory's original letter had actually claimed. Let yourself rest a little heavier into the bed beneath you for a moment. None of this history is happening to you tonight. You're simply listening warm and safe while it drifts by. By the 14th century, that darker association had fully entered the machinery of formal accusation. In Ireland, in 1324, a noblewoman named Alice Kittler stood trial for heresy, and among the accusations levelled against her was the claim that she kept a demonic companion that took the shape of a black cat. Alice herself, wealthy and well-connected, managed to flee to England before facing the full weight of the charges, but the case set a grim precedent regardless. Her maidservant, far less fortunate and far less able to escape, was ultimately burned at the stake in her place, one of the earliest recorded executions in the British Isles, explicitly tied to accusations of witchcraft. Folk belief had by this point moved well past the idea of cats merely symbolizing evil in a distant ritual. Now the claim was more intimate and considerably more dangerous that certain women accused witches could transform into cats themselves, moving unseen through the night in animal form to do harm no one could prove or disprove. Think about what that particular belief actually did to an already vulnerable population. A woman living alone, unmarried, elderly, or simply unpopular with her neighbours now faced a new category of suspicion, entirely divorced from anything she had actually done. Did a cat cross someone's path at an unlucky moment? Did livestock sicken the same week a widow was seen feeding a stray? The belief in feline shape-shifting gave communities already primed by fear, poverty and religious anxiety a ready-made explanation for whatever misfortune came along, and a ready-made target within easy reach. By 1484, this entire current of belief had climbed all the way to the highest office in the Church. Pope Innocent VIII issued his own formal declaration explicitly naming the cat as the devil's favoured animal and the idol of witches everywhere, a statement that, unlike Gregory's more narrowly targeted letter, 2.5 centuries earlier left considerably less room for nuance. Where Vox in Rama had condemned one alleged secret cult, this later declaration painted the species itself with unmistakable suspicion, cementing black cats specifically as walking symbols of witchcraft in the popular imagination for generations to come. It is worth noticing how much distance separates these two documents. a century and a half apart. The earlier one narrowly aimed at a single alleged sect, the later one broad enough to fall over an entire species. That gap is really the story of this whole chapter in miniature, a single specific fear slowly generalizing itself outward until it swallowed something far larger than anyone had originally intended. What followed was not one single dramatic purge, but something arguably worse: centuries of scattered, ongoing, locally organized cruelty, woven into festivals and folk custom, rather than confined to formal church trials. In towns across France, cats were gathered into baskets or wicker cages, and burned in public bonfires on certain feast days, often timed to coincide with the summer celebration of St. John, a tradition that persisted in various forms for generations, and in some regions reportedly continued in a diminished way into the 17th century. Local nobility sometimes attended these bonfires as honoured guests, a detail that says something uncomfortable about how thoroughly this particular cruelty had settled into ordinary civic life rather than remaining some fringe activity. In the Flemish town of Ypres, cats were reportedly thrown from the belfry tower of the Cloth Hall, a building where cats had once been kept quite practically to protect stored wool from rodents. The exact origin of that particular custom is debated among historians today, some tracing it to genuine population control once the wool season ended, others to the same lingering suspicion of black magic running through the wider region. The practice continued in one form or another until 1817, considerably closer to our own era than most people assume when they first hear the story. There is a modern echo worth mentioning here, a strange kind of redemption arc. That same town in Belgium now holds a joyful triennial festival called the Cat Parade, where a costumed jester tosses plush toy cats from that same tower, down to cheering crowds below a deliberate gentle inversion of the darker practice it commemorates. History rarely offers a tidy apology. This one, in its own small, slightly odd way, comes near to one. Now, about that connection to the plague, it is worth pausing here because this is exactly the kind of tempting, satisfying historical claim that deserves real scrutiny rather than easy acceptance. The theory goes like this: mass killings of cats across Europe reduced the population of natural rat predators, which allowed rat numbers to explode unchecked, which in turn allowed the fleas carried by those rats to spread the plague bacteria far more efficiently once the Black Death arrived in the mid-1300s. It is a clean, satisfying chain of cause and effect, the kind that fits neatly into a single sentence and travels beautifully as across centuries of retelling. It also runs into some serious problems once historians look closely. For one, cat persecution across medieval Europe was never centralized, coordinated, or complete enough to meaningfully crash the overall rat predator population at the exact continental scale required for this theory to hold together. These were scattered local customs, a bonfire in one French town, a tower in one Flemish city, not an organized continent-wide extermination campaign carried out on any kind of unified timeline. For another, modern research into how the plague actually spread has also increasingly pointed toward human fleas and lice, not exclusively rat fleas, as major transmission vectors, complicating a story that depends entirely on rats as the sole villain of the piece. Maybe reduced cat populations played some small local hard-to-measure role in a few particularly hard-hit towns. Maybe the timing is simply a coincidence too tempting for storytellers to leave alone two truly terrible chapters of medieval history, sitting near enough together on the calendar to feel connected whether or not the evidence actually supports it. Or maybe, and this is the answer, serious historians tend to land on the honest connection between medieval cat persecution and the Black Death is considerably weaker and considerably messier than the tidy version makes it sound a case, where two real tragedies got stitched together into one dramatic story, because the dramatic version was simply more satisfying to tell than the complicated truth. It says something about our own habits, honestly, that this particular myth has survived so much longer and travelled so much further than the more accurate, less dramatic version of events. We tend to prefer a villain we can name and a clean line from cause to catastrophe, even when the real historical record insists on staying stubbornly tangled. There is a bitter kind of irony sitting underneath this entire chapter worth naming before we move on. The very quality Rome had once celebrated in this animal, that stubborn, ungovernable independence Roman citizens carved onto statues of their own goddess of liberty, was the exact same quality medieval Europe eventually turned against her. A creature that answers to no one, that moves unseen through the night, on business, entirely its own, that cannot be commanded the way a dog can, makes a natural symbol of freedom to a society that prizes autonomy. It makes an equally natural object of suspicion to a society gripped by fear of hidden uncontrollable forces. Nothing about the cat herself had changed in the centuries between those two reactions. Only the mood of the humans looking at her had. Through all of this darkness, though something worth remembering did not disappear entirely. Even at the height of European suspicion toward the household cat, an entirely different community kept right on, depending on her for the exact same reason farmers and merchants always had. Grain still needed guarding. Rats still needed hunting. Superstition, as widespread as it was on dry land, had a way of quietly losing its grip the moment the conversation turned to the one place where survival truly depended on keeping the rodent population under control, no matter what a preacher. 3 villages inland happened to believe about black cats and the devil, and nowhere was that need more urgent or more impossible to ignore than aboard a wooden ship about to cross an ocean no European sailor had ever crossed before. A ship has no room for superstition it cannot afford. On land, a farmer 3 villages over might whisper about black cats and hidden evil, and lose nothing but an afternoon's gossip either way. At sea, months from the nearest port, with an entire crew's survival riding on how long the grain holds out, that same superstition becomes a luxury nobody could actually pay for. It is one thing to fear a cat. It is another thing entirely to fear the alternative. Picture the hold of a merchant vessel somewhere off the coast of Catalonia, sometime in the final years of the 1400s. The ship rolls gently with the swell timbers, groaning in that particular rhythm every sailor eventually stops noticing. The air below deck smells of tar brine and the dry, dusty warmth of stacked grain sacks, barely lit by whatever daylight manages to slip through the hatch above. Somewhere among those sacks, a cat moves without hurry, without wasted motion, doing the same job her ancestors had done in fertile crescent granaries 10,000 years earlier, except now the walls around her creak and sway with the rhythm of open water instead of standing still on solid ground. She has never once questioned why the ground beneath her feet refuses to hold still. It is simply the job now. The mice do not care whether the floor is stone or timber, and neither particularly does she. In 1494, the port city of Barcelona formalized something ship captains along the Mediterranean had clearly already understood for generations. A body of maritime regulations known as the Consolato del Mare, one of the most influential shipping codes in medieval and early modern Europe, addressed a very specific, very practical problem. If rats destroyed cargo during a voyage, the ship's owner would ordinarily be held financially responsible for the loss. The code included one notable exception, though. A captain who kept a cat aboard doing her job was excused from that liability entirely. Rat damage, in other words, was treated as the captain's fault, unless he had already taken the one sensible precaution available to him. Sit with that for a moment. This is not folklore. This is not a charming anecdote passed down through sailors' tales. This is a formal written legal code, the kind of document that settled real financial disputes in real courtrooms, explicitly building an entire cat's presence into the definition of reasonable care aboard a ship. At the exact same historical moment, European pulpits and local courts were entertaining accusations of feline witchcraft on dry land European maritime law was quietly writing the ship's cat into the basic architecture of commercial responsibility. There is a version of this whole story you could tell purely through law books and shipping ledgers, rather than sermons and trial records, and it would paint a considerably kinder picture of medieval attitudes toward this animal than the one we spent the last chapter walking through. Two institutions, the church and the merchant class, looked at the exact same creature during the exact same decades, and reached almost opposite conclusions about what she represented, one treating her as a potential vessel for the devil, the other treating her as a documented, insurable safeguard against financial ruin. Both views existed simultaneously, often within the very same town, sometimes within the very same family. Why would the law bother getting so specific about one particular animal? Because the alternative was not some abstract, distant risk. It was catastrophic, immediate, and entirely predictable. A ship's hold packed with grain-dried meat and ship's biscuit sealed for weeks or months at a time was exactly the kind of environment rats thrive in, the same equation that had first drawn a wildcat toward a human granary, thousands of years earlier, simply relocated onto water. Left unchecked, rats did not just eat provisions. They gnawed through ropes, through wooden hull timbers, through anything standing between the crew and the sea outside. A merchant captain without a working cat on board was not merely careless. He was gambling with the structural integrity of his own ship. Some of the earliest and most famous voyages of this era carried exactly this kind of practical passenger without much fanfare at all. Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan both sailed with cats aboard their ships, a detail that rarely makes it into the grand retelling of either man's story buried beneath the maps, the mutinies, and the historic landfalls. Neither explorer, as far as the surviving records show, thought the animal worth much comment at all, which tells its own quiet story. A cat on board a ship of this era was not a novelty worth writing home about. She was simply as ordinary and as necessary as a barrel of fresh water, present on nearly every serious voyage of the age precisely because nobody could afford for her not to be there. Nobody wrote an epic about the cat. She simply did her job mile after open ocean mile exactly as expected, while history's attention stayed fixed on the humans steering the ship. Long before any of these voyages, though, a different set of northern sailors had already worked out this same practical arrangement wrapped in a mythology entirely their own. Norse sailors carried cats aboard their longships as they pushed steadily westward across the North Atlantic, settling Iceland, then Greenland, centuries before Columbus ever left Spain. In Norse mythology, the goddess Freya associated with love fertility, and a particular kind of fierce independence was said to travel in a chariot, pulled not by horses but by two enormous cats, a gift according to the old stories from the god Thor himself. Some accounts even describe a Viking wedding custom, in which a newly married couple received a kitten as a blessing, invoking Freya's favour over their household, a small furry stand-in for a goddess who could not attend the ceremony in person. Shut your eyes for a moment if they are not shut already, and picture Freya's chariot the way a Viking storyteller might have described it around a longhouse fire, two enormous cats straining against their harness, hauling a goddess of love and war across the northern sky, while grey seas churned somewhere far below. It is a strange, striking image worlds away from anything a Roman or an Egyptian storyteller would have conjured, and it tells you something about how differently separate cultures kept finding new ways to make room for this animal at the very centre of their most important stories. There is something worth noticing in that contrast if you set it beside everything we just covered about medieval Christian Europe. In Norse belief before Christianity fully took hold across Scandinavia, the cat rode beside a goddess of love and fertility, an emblem of good fortune rather than suspicion. It was the same animal doing the same work carried across the same cold northern water, and yet an entirely different religious framework handed her an entirely different reputation. Once again, as we've seen again and again throughout this story, it was never really about the cat changing. It was about which set of human beliefs happened to be looking at her. By the time European ships were crossing the Atlantic on a regular basis, this practical, mostly unglamorous partnership had become so routine that almost nobody thought to write it down as anything remarkable. Let yourself settle a little further into the quiet of wherever you are tonight before we cross that ocean together too. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. In 1620, when a small ship called the Mayflower carried a group of English settlers toward what would become the northeastern coast of what is now the United States Cats, very likely travelled among the cargo the same essential insurance every serious ocean voyage of the era required. Space aboard a ship like that was brutally limited. Every barrel and sack accounted for every extra mouth to feed, weighed carefully against its usefulness. A cat earned her passage the same way she always had, not through sentiment, but through simple, unglamorous necessity, keeping the colony's precious seed grain and provisions safe through a crossing that could stretch past 2 difficult months at sea. Many modern breed historians trace part of the ancestry of the American Shorthair, one of the oldest and most recognizable cat breeds native to the United States, back to exactly this kind of hard-working colonial ship's cat, animal selected for nothing more glamorous than sheer competence at keeping a ship, and later, a settlement stores free of rodents. If you have ever owned a cat with absolutely no interest in being fussed over, entirely focused on her own business, you may be looking at the temperament that helped build a nation's earliest food security, whether anyone at the time gave her any credit for it. Not every ship's cat faded quietly into the historical background, though. Some earned names, reputations, even genuine fame. Consider Trim, who sailed with the British navigator Matthew Flinders during his early 19th century voyage circumnavigating the entire continent of Australia, a voyage that would prove for the first time that Australia was a single connected landmass rather than a scatter of separate territories. Trim reportedly earned his place in Flinders' affections early on, after falling overboard as a kitten and swimming determinedly back to the ship, rather than accepting rescue, a small display of stubborn competence that apparently won the young navigator over completely. Flinders wrote about Trim with obvious unguarded affection, praising his courage, his cleverness, and his steady companionship across years of difficult, uncertain sailing. Trim survived shipwreck alongside his human companion and stayed by his side through captivity on a French-held island during a period of war between Britain and France, years when Flinders himself was effectively a prisoner far from home. When Trim eventually died quietly and without ceremony, as cats so often do, Flinders wrote a heartfelt tribute to him, an unusually tender document from a naval officer of that era, describing a friendship that clearly meant considerably more to him than simple pest control ever could. Statues honouring Trim stand today outside libraries in both Australia and England, a cat memorialised in bronze for a partnership built entirely at sea, far from any grain store or Roman road. Let that sit with you for a moment. An animal whose entire relationship with humanity began thousands of years earlier, with nothing more than mutual convenience around a pile of grain, had by now become someone a grown man, wrote grieving letters about someone worth casting in bronze on 2 separate continents, someone whose small, stubborn swim back toward a ship as a frightened kitten apparently mattered enough to remember for the rest of a sailor's life. The ship's cat story did not end when the age of sail eventually gave way to steel hulls and steam engines either. Naval tradition carried the practice forward well into the 20th century through 2 world wars fought largely by sea. One particularly resilient German ship's cat adopted by British sailors after surviving the sinking of his original vessel during the Second World War went on to survive the sinking of 2 further ships before finally retiring safely on land, earning the nickname Unsinkable Sam among the sailors who considered him something near a good luck charm by that point, Another cat named Simon served aboard a British warship during a tense standoff on a Chinese river in 1949, a confrontation that left the vessel trapped under hostile fire for weeks. Simon was wounded during the initial bombardment, yet continued hunting rats that threatened the crew's dwindling food and water supplies throughout the ordeal, reportedly even visiting wounded sailors in the ship's makeshift hospital, an unofficial source of comfort during a truly frightening standoff. He was later awarded a medal recognizing outstanding animal service under fire, a distinction normally reserved for military dogs and horses, and remains to this day the only cat in history ever to receive that particular honor. Notice for a moment how much these later stories echo the very first loop of this entire journey. A solitary hunter valued for exactly one skill, quietly proving that skill worth far more than anyone originally expected of her. The setting had changed, desert to farmhouse to temple to ship, but the underlying shape of the relationship, competence earning trust, slowly deepening into something closer to affection, had barely shifted at all across 10,000 years. From a Barcelona courtroom in 1494 to a decorated warship in the middle of the 20th century, nearly 5 centuries had passed, and the essential shape of this particular job had barely changed at all. Guard the food, watch the dark corners, answer to no one but do the work anyway, whether the reward was a warm hearth, a bronze statue, or a medal pinned to a collar that would never quite fit right. But somewhere in among all of that hard practical saltwater history, a very different kind of transformation was quietly getting underway back on dry land. The cat who had spent this entire story earning her keep first, from farmers, then from priests, then from sea captains, was about to meet an entirely new kind of admirer, one far less interested in what she could catch, and considerably more interested in what she looked like while doing it. 10,000 years is a long time to wait for someone to finally sit down and pay proper attention. Farmers had valued her, priests had worshipped her, sailors had trusted her with their lives quite literally aboard ships where a single overlooked rat could rot an entire hold of grain. And yet through every single one of those centuries, nobody not once had ever actually sat down and deliberately decided what she should look like. That particular kind of attention, the kind that measures, compares, and selects for appearance alone, was still waiting for her patiently in a glass and iron building in South London. On the 13th of July 1871, the Crystal Palace, an enormous exhibition hall of glass and cast iron originally built for London's Great Exhibition, 2 decades earlier opened its doors to an event nobody in history had ever organised before. Sunlight poured down through thousands of glass panes overhead, catching on polished cage bars and the anxious, unfamiliar faces of animals that had until that morning spent their entire lives on kitchen hearths and farmhouse windowsills, rather than under public scrutiny. Roughly 170 cats collected from households across Britain sat in individual cages arranged along the hall, waiting to be examined, compared and judged not on how many mice they had caught that season, but on how they looked. The man behind this peculiar spectacle was an artist and illustrator named Harrison Weir, a lifelong cat enthusiast who had spent years sketching and studying the animal, with an attention most of his contemporaries reserved for prize livestock. Weir had approached the Crystal Palace's management the previous year with an idea that on paper must have sounded faintly absurd. A formal show with classes, standards and prizes built entirely around the house, cat and animal that up to this point in its entire 10,000-year relationship with humanity had never once been considered worth exhibiting purely for its appearance. Cattle got shows, horses got shows, even pigeons and rabbits had their own devoted competitive circles by this point in the century. The cat everywhere else in this story, a working animal first and a companion second, had simply never been invited to that particular party. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment because it cuts right to the heart of everything we have covered across this entire journey. If you had listened to every previous chapter of this story, you would already know that cats had spent 10,000 years quietly, almost accidentally shaping their own relationship with humanity, largely without any human ever sitting down and deliberately choosing which cat got to breed with which or which traits were worth preserving on purpose. We even gave that fact a name earlier in this story, domestication without a domesticator. So what changed on this particular July afternoon in 1871 that finally after 10 entire millennia put an actual domesticator in the room? The honest answer says less about the cat herself and more about the peculiar obsessions of Victorian Britain. This was a society utterly captivated by classification by taxonomy, by the confident belief that almost anything in the natural world could be measured, ranked and improved through careful selection, an intellectual mood shaped by everything from Charles Darwin's recently published work on the origin of species to the era's enormous appetite for natural history, museums, zoological gardens and public exhibitions of every conceivable kind. Dog breeders had already been formalizing their own competitive shows for years by this point, and horse and cattle breeding societies had existed for generations before that. A formal kennel club for organizing dog breed standards would itself only follow 2 years later in 1873, meaning Weir's cat show actually arrived slightly ahead of its canine counterpart, a detail most people understandably never guess correctly. Weir's truly novel insight was not that selective breeding for appearance could work. Everyone already knew it could. His insight was that nobody had yet bothered applying that same energy to the cat, an animal Victorian households increasingly kept indoors purely for company, rather than strictly for pest control, and that this oversight in a culture this obsessed with ranking and improving domestic animals was clearly just waiting to be corrected. Rest a little deeper into wherever you happen to be tonight. None of this Victorian fuss and feather needs your full attention to still land softly. Let your breathing settle slow, and even while we keep wandering through this glass hall together, if you have ever wondered why your own cat seems entirely unbothered by the idea of being judged on her appearance, you can trace that particular indifference back exactly this far. For 10,000 years nobody asked her to look a certain way. She only had to be useful. Then quite suddenly in one glass building in South London, an entirely new set of rules arrived, and she understandably never got the memo. Walk the hall on that July afternoon and you would have found exhibits considerably stranger than a modern cat show tends to offer. Among the entries sat an enormous black Persian that had once belonged to the recently deceased former Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, its late owner's political fame apparently adding an extra layer of prestige to the cage, as though the cat itself carried a faint whiff of Downing Street about her. Elsewhere in the hall, in a detail that says something rather telling about how blurry the line between wild and domestic still felt, to Victorian visitors, organisers displayed an actual Scottish wildcat, its paw injured in a trap on the estate of a Scottish duke, presented almost as though she belonged in the same competitive category as the household pets around her, hissing most likely at every well-dressed visitor who leaned in near for a better look. It is a strange thing to picture now, a truly wild predator sharing a hall with pampered parlour cats groomed for the occasion, but it was in its own way a living reminder, whether anyone intended it that way or not, of exactly how recently in the grand sweep of this story that particular wildness had ever left the bloodline at all. Weir and two fellow judges, including his own brother, moved slowly along the rows of cages working from written standards Weir himself had drafted specifically for this occasion, the very first attempt in recorded history to put into words what a prize-winning cat was actually supposed to look like. It is worth noting that Weir's original standards leaned heavily on coat colour and pattern, rather than the detailed body structure modern cat shows obsess over today. A tabby needed the right stripe pattern. A tortoiseshell needed the right distribution of colour. The precise shape of a skull or the exact proportion of an ear categories that would come to dominate cat breeding in the century that followed barely registered on Weir's original scorecard at all. He was in a sense still learning the vocabulary for a competition that had never previously existed, inventing the grammar of cat judging one written standard at a time. The event was by every account a considerable success, popular enough with the Victorian public that similar shows quickly spread to other cities, and popular enough that Weir himself went on 16 years later to found the National Cat Club, serving as its first president, and to publish a detailed book on cat care and breeding that helped cement his reputation as the closest thing this entire story has to a founding figure of formal cat breeding as we understand it today. Around this same general period, entirely new breeds began arriving in Britain from far beyond Europe, feeding directly into this newly organised enthusiasm. Cats from Siam in Southeast Asia, slender blue-eyed and strikingly different in build from the sturdy British shorthairs, most Victorian households already knew, began appearing at these shows toward the end of the century, formal enough in their following that a specific written breed standard for what the era called the Royal Siamese was drawn up within just over a decade of that first Crystal Palace show by 1882. Long-haired cats from the mountainous regions of Persia and Afghanistan, already trickling into Europe through earlier trade routes, found themselves suddenly organised into their own dedicated show classes, as well admired specifically for the dense flowing coat that had, until this point in the story, simply been an accident of climate and geography rather than anything anyone had deliberately selected for. Here is where this chapter of the story deserves an honest, slightly harder edge rather than a purely celebratory one. Once breeders started deliberately selecting for specific exaggerated physical traits, generation after generation, some of those traits drifted further from anything nature alone would have produced. The Persian's face prized increasingly for its flatness and roundness, as decades past would eventually be bred in some later bloodlines to an extreme that caused real breathing difficulties, a cautionary thread running underneath the whole story of aesthetic breeding that is worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. The Siamese cat's body type shifted dramatically across the 20th century as well, from a rounder, stockier original form toward the sharply angular wedge-headed silhouette. Most people picture today an entire breed's physical identity reshaped within a handful of generations, purely by human preference rather than anything resembling natural selection. None of this is meant to cast Weir himself or the ordinary Victorian cat lovers filling that hall in 1871 as villains in the story. Weir's own early standards focused on colour and pattern rather than exaggerated structure look considerably gentler than where some later breeding trends eventually landed. It is simply worth remembering as this story moves closer to the present day that once a domesticator finally did enter the room after 10,000 years of her shaping herself almost entirely on her own terms, that new kind of attention carried real consequences alongside its genuine affection. Consequences some breeds are still working through today, generations later, as modern breeders increasingly try to correct the more extreme results of a century and a half of purely aesthetic selection. It is worth sitting with the strange irony buried in that particular consequence. For 10,000 years, this animal survived almost entirely on her own biological terms, changing barely at all despite constant proximity to humans. The moment humans finally did decide to actively shape her deliberately and on purpose, the changes arrived considerably faster and not always kindly. There is something else worth noticing about this whole Victorian turn. Something that has less to do with breeding standards and rather more to do with where the cat was actually allowed to make her home. For most of the 10,000 years covered by this story, she belonged physically mostly outdoors or in working spaces. A barn, a granary, a ship's hold tolerated indoors on her own terms but rarely designed around. The Victorian parlour changed that arrangement rather completely. A prize-winning, carefully bred cat, especially among Britain's growing and increasingly comfortable middle class, became a genuine indoor fixture displayed on cushions rather than granary sacks, groomed rather than simply tolerated an ornament of domestic taste as much as a pet. Ask yourself this: why did an increasingly wealthy, increasingly urban middle class sitting in parlours far removed from any actual granary or barn suddenly care so much about an animal whose entire original value had been agricultural? Part of the answer sits in simple economics. Fewer Victorian households, especially in growing cities, needed a working mouser the way a farming family 2 centuries earlier had. Part of it sits in something closer to social display, a well-groomed prize-winning cat serving as a small visible signal of taste, leisure, and disposable income, not unlike a well-tended garden or a fashionable piece of furniture. The same broader cultural moment that founded Britain's first organised animal welfare society decades earlier had also been quietly reshaping how comfortable households thought about animals in general, less as pure labour, more as objects worthy of sentiment care and increasingly careful aesthetic curation. If you keep a cat today who has never once been asked to catch a single mouse in her entire life, whose primary job description consists of looking beautiful on your sofa and occasionally allowing you to pet her, you're living inside the direct unbroken legacy of exactly this particular Victorian shift, a shift that took an animal valued for 10,000 years, primarily for what she did, and quietly, deliberately began valuing her, instead for simply how she looked doing nothing at all. Weir himself, by most accounts, seemed to truly adore the animals at the centre of his life's peculiar project, describing the ordinary house cat curled by a fireside as possessing a beauty that had gone almost entirely unrecognised until his own generation finally thought to look properly. Whatever complicated legacy his particular brand of formalised, standardised breeding eventually produced that original impulse, simply wanting the world to notice something beautiful that had been sitting quietly by the fire. The entire time feels in its own way like a fitting bridge between everything this story had already covered and everything still left to come. Because for all of Weir's careful standards, all his measured coat patterns and formalised breed classes, something considerably older and considerably wilder was still sitting underneath every single one of those pedigreed prize-winning coats, patient and largely unbothered by a century of human effort to reshape her. A judge could measure the exact shade of a tabby stripe. He could not measure, and never really tried to measure whatever it was, still coiled quietly in her instincts, waiting unchanged beneath the ribbon pinned proudly to her cage. Whatever Victorian breeders managed to change about the inside of this animal, it turns out had a stubborn habit of staying exactly where it started. Not every turning point in this story announces itself with a temple, a papal decree, or a ship crossing an unmapped ocean. Some of the most quietly transformative moments in this entire 10,000-year relationship arrived instead through something considerably smaller, considerably less dignified, and considerably more American. A frozen sandbox, a bag of industrial clay, and a man who happened to have both sitting in the trunk of his car. Picture South Bend, Indiana in January of 1947. Winter has locked the ground, solid grey slush lining the roads, breath fogging in the cold every time a door opens. A woman named Kay Draper is having a small, entirely unglamorous crisis. Her cat's outdoor sandbox has frozen over completely useless in the cold, and she has come looking for ashes, the standard fallback most cat owners of the era relied on when sand was not available. The man she asks, a 27-year-old Navy veteran named Edward Lowe, working alongside his father selling sawdust sand and industrial clay out of a modest storefront, does not have any ashes to spare. What he does have, sitting in the back of his 1943 Chevrolet Coupe, is a bag of granulated clay his family had been marketing to factories as an absorbent for grease spills, chosen specifically because it would not catch fire the way sawdust could on a busy factory floor, on something closer to a hunch than a plan, mostly by his own later admission. just to get a persistent customer out of his shop. Lo handed her the bag anyway. She came back for more within the week. Here is a fact worth sitting with for a moment because it says something surprising about how history actually moves. For the entire span of this story, 10,000 years of temples, empires, papal decrees, and formal cat shows, the single most significant everyday obstacle to keeping a cat comfortably indoors had never really been solved. Ashes tracked filthy footprints across every floor they touched. Sand froze solid the moment winter arrived. A cat who spent her life almost entirely indoors, the way Victorian breeders back in the previous chapter of this story had begun to imagine her still needed somewhere to relieve herself, and nobody across 10 entire millennia had quite figured out a clean, practical answer. Lo's clay, made from a mineral called fuller's earth, absorbed moisture and odour far more effectively than sand or ash ever had, and critically did not cling to a cat's paws and scatter across the household with every step. He packaged it in 5-pound bags, wrote 2 words on the front in marker kitty litter, and brought it to a local store where the owner, by most accounts, thought the whole idea was faintly ridiculous. Who would pay 65 cents for a bag of dirt when sand cost next to nothing? Quite a lot of people, as it turned out, though. It took considerable stubbornness on Lo's part to prove it. Lo spent years driving the product around the country himself, sacks stacked in the back of his car, handing out free samples to skeptical shopkeepers who could not quite believe anyone would pay for what looked to the untrained eye like ordinary dirt. He reportedly even offered to clean litter trays at cat shows in exchange for a small space to display his bags, considerably less glamorous version of the aristocratic show floors we walked through. In the last chapter of this story, trading manual labour for the smallest possible foothold in front of the exact audience most likely to care. Ask yourself this: which single moment do you suspect actually changed more ordinary cats' daily lives across America? A formal cat show held once in a glass palace in London, attended by a few hundred wealthy Victorians, or a bag of absorbent clay quietly making its way into millions of ordinary households over the following decades? The clay wins, and it is not particularly near a fair fight. Within a few decades of Lo's invention, cats had overtaken dogs as the most commonly kept pet in the United States, a shift historians and journalists alike have directly credited, at least in part, to one unglamorous bag of industrial clay, solving a problem that had quietly limited how many cats could stay comfortably indoors since the very beginning of this story. There is something worth noticing in that particular irony. Emperors, popes, and formally trained breeders had all in their own dramatic ways tried to shape this animal's place in human life. In the end, an unremarkable clay salesman from Indiana, trying mostly just to get a persistent customer out of his shop, may have done more to reshape the daily reality of cat ownership than any of them. Let yourself settle a little further down into wherever you happen to be resting tonight. This story is almost home now, and there is no need to hold on to every detail as we go. Let your shoulders drop that last little bit. Whatever thoughts are still circling, let them slow down along with my voice. While Lo's invention was quietly reshaping where cats could make their home, a separate and considerably more surprising discovery was unfolding in laboratories, studying how cats actually talk. If you own a cat, you already know the sound intimately, that particular insistent meow aimed directly at you the moment a food bowl runs low or a door refuses to open on command. Here is the detail that tends to catch people off guard the first time they hear it. Adult cats living among other cats rarely meow at one another at all, scent-marking body posture, the position of an ear or a tail. These carry the real weight of cat-to-cat communication, an entire vocabulary built from millions of years spent as a solitary hunter, who never needed to coordinate loudly with anyone. The meow in its adult form is something closer to a special dialect she appears to have developed, kept and refined almost entirely for us. Researchers who have studied this closely have found that cats even adjust the pitch of their voice depending on the audience. Recordings comparing cat vocalizations aimed at humans against those aimed at other cats found a noticeably higher average pitch reserved specifically for us, somewhere in the range of 600 Hz toward a person compared to under 450 Hz toward another cat. A frequency shift too consistent across different animals to be an accident. In kittens, that same higher-pitched call serves one clear purpose, summoning a mother's attention. Somewhere along the long arc of this relationship, adult cats appear to have simply kept using it, redirected entirely toward the species that had replaced in a sense the role her own mother once played. Sit with that for a moment, because it may be one of the most quietly moving facts in this entire story. Nothing forced this to happen. No breeder selected for it. No law required it, and yet somewhere across 10,000 years an animal famous throughout this journey for needing absolutely nothing from anyone appears to have developed an entirely separate form of communication, one she does not even bother using with her own kind, apparently just for the purpose of reaching us. If she never needed us, why go to the trouble of learning to speak in her own limited way, a language built specifically for a conversation with an entirely different species? Modern researchers studying animal bonding have also turned their attention to exactly this question, comparing cats directly against dogs for the first time in any rigorous way. Scientists already knew that a dog gazing into its owner's eyes triggers a measurable release of oxytocin, the same hormone bound up in the bond between a parent and a newborn child, a mutual reinforcing loop of eye contact and chemistry that wolves notably do not share with their human handlers. For years, that finding fed a quiet, sometimes unspoken assumption that dogs simply bonded with people on some deeper biological level. Cats never quite managed an assumption. Plenty of dog owners have probably repeated at some point smugly to a long-suffering cat-owning friend. More recent research complicates that assumption considerably. Cats, it turns out, are not absent from this picture. They simply are not playing by the same rules dogs use. Where a dog leans into prolonged eye contact, a cat tends to rely on something far more understated, a slow, deliberate half-closing of the eyes, often called the slow blink, a gesture cat behaviorists increasingly describe as something near a feline smile, a quiet signal of trust and safety, exchanged at her own pace on her own terms, rather than through sustained staring, a truly wild ancestor would have interpreted as a threat. Recent laboratory work administering oxytocin directly to cats has even found real, if more understated and more selective shifts in how closely they watch the humans around them afterward, suggesting whatever chemistry underlies affection in a dog has some quieter cousin operating inside a cat as well, just expressed through a different vocabulary entirely, on a schedule that was never going to bend to match a dog's. If you have ever locked eyes with your own cat across a room and watched her blink back at you slowly, deliberately, and felt something in your chest respond to it without quite knowing why you were not imagining it, that is not a coincidence, and it is not nothing. It is simply a bond written in a dialect all her own. And yet for everything this final stretch of science has revealed about attachment, communication, and affection, one truth from earlier in this story remains stubbornly, almost defiantly intact. Take any of these same cats raised entirely indoors, fed from a bowl every single day of her life, fluent in her own particular language for reaching you, and place her back outside with no human contact at all. Within a matter of weeks, sometimes days, she reverts. Modern trap, neuter, and return programs working with feral cat colonies in cities around the world see this transformation constantly. Volunteers who spend their evenings trapping strays in alleyways and parking lots, watching again and again an animal who spent years sleeping on a cushion, rediscovering almost instantly how to hunt, how to mark territory, how to survive entirely on her own, exactly as her ancestor did in an open desert 10,000 years before any of this story began. The same programs, incidentally, quietly represent the closest thing to a modern humane echo of that earlier darker chapter we spent time on in this story, managing outdoor cat populations not through fear or superstition, but through something considerably gentler: sterilization, vaccination, and a watchful eye before releasing each cat straight back to the only life she'd ever actually chosen for herself. Nothing about that wildness ever actually left. It was simply waiting patiently underneath the meowing, the slow, blinking the litter box and the pedigree papers for exactly the moment it might be needed again. There is one more modern shift worth naming before this chapter winds down quieter than a papal decree, less dramatic than a plague, but arguably more consequential for more individual cats than almost anything else in this entire story. Safe, affordable spaying and neutering, which only became widely available and broadly practiced across much of the 20th century, gave humans, for the first time in 10,000 years, genuine control over how many cats existed at all. Earlier chapters of this story were built around selection: which cats survived, which cats got carried onto a ship or bred for a particular coat pattern. This was something different: the ability to simply choose for an individual animal whether the next generation happened at all. It is easy to overlook a piece of veterinary medicine sitting quietly behind the scenes of this whole story, but it may have done more to shape the actual population of cats alive on Earth right now than every deliberate breeding decision made since Harrison Weir first opened that show hall in London. Which brings this entire 10,000-year journey to one final question worth carrying with you as we near the end of this chapter. If she never fully needed us, and clearly still does not, what exactly do we call a relationship built this way, freely offered rather than demanded, easily walked away from, and yet in the vast majority of cases never actually abandoned at all? That question does not belong only to historians, geneticists and behaviourists anymore. By this point in the story, it belongs to you too, and to whatever quiet, half-wild creature may be curled up somewhere near you right now, still carrying the whole of this journey inside her, without knowing a single word of it. Before we let this particular creature settle into her final resting place in tonight's story, there is one more sound worth listening to. One we have somehow made it this entire journey without properly stopping to examine. Not the meow which we have already traced back to a kitten calling for her mother. Something older, quieter, and considerably stranger once you actually look closely at it. The purr. Most people assume a purring cat is simply a happy cat, and often enough that is exactly right. A cat settling into a warm lap, needing a blanket, half asleep in a patch of afternoon sun, purring gently matches everything we would expect from a contented animal. But researchers who have spent real time studying this sound have noticed something that does not fit that simple explanation at all. Cats also purr while injured, sometimes badly. They purr while giving birth, an event that is anything but relaxing. Veterinarians have reported cats purring in the final moments before death, and mother cats purring while nursing kittens who are themselves too young to purr back. Whatever this sound actually is, it clearly is not only a signal of contentment, and that contradiction sent bioacoustic researchers looking for a stranger, more physical explanation. What they found, measuring the purr with the same kind of equipment used to study animal calls across dozens of species, was a sound sitting consistently in a frequency range between roughly 25 and 150 vibrations per second. That particular range happens to overlap almost exactly with frequencies medical researchers have separately found useful for stimulating bone density and encouraging tissue repair in physical therapy settings. The leading hypothesis, still very much an open and actively studied question, rather than settled fact, suggests the purr may function as a kind of built-in low-cost healing mechanism. A way for an animal whose ancestors could never afford a lengthy recovery from injury in the wild to quite literally vibrate her own bones and soft tissue back toward health, while conserving as much energy as possible in the process. There is a small, almost charming postscript to this particular thread of research. Scientists studying how the human body holds up during extended time in zero gravity, where astronauts steadily lose bone density, the longer they stay in orbit, have taken a genuine interest in this exact frequency range, wondering whether a similar mechanical vibration might help slow that loss during long space missions. Which means if that research eventually pans out, a species first drawn toward humanity by nothing more glamorous than a pile of spilled grain may end up quietly contributing something to how we keep human bodies intact on the way to Mars, an ancestry line that started in a desert, potentially closing its loop somewhere among the stars. Sit with that possibility for a moment. The same sound you may associate purely with a warm, contented weight settling onto your lap might also be a survival tool inherited from a solitary desert hunter who had no veterinarian, no caste, no crutches, nothing but her own body's ability to knit itself back together in silence. Some researchers studying this effect have even begun exploring whether similar vibration frequencies might help human patients, an animal whose ancestors first approached us over 10,000 years ago, for nothing more than easy access to rodents, quietly offering us a small piece of medical inspiration, in return entirely by accident, simply by being exactly what she has always been. If you've ever felt a cat curl against you during a difficult week, purring steadily against your chest while you cried or worried, or simply could not sleep and felt something in your own body loosen slightly in response, you were not imagining that either. You may in fact have been sitting inside the exact frequency range her body reserves for healing offered to you, the same way it has always offered itself to her. Let your body settle now fully into wherever you're resting. There is nowhere left to go tonight but towards sleep, and nothing left in this story that needs holding on to tightly. Just let the rest of it wash over you. Let's go back for a moment, all the way back to the very beginning of this long journey together, to a solitary hunter standing at the edge of a dry riverbed, watching the first flicker of human firelight appear on a distant horizon, wanting absolutely nothing to do with any of it. We asked at the very start of all this how an animal built entirely for independence, an animal that needed nothing from anyone, ended up becoming one of the most quietly successful species on the entire planet, present today in nearly every country on Earth, curled up in more homes than almost any other creature humans have ever chosen to share a life with. Think of everywhere that solitary hunters' descendants ended up travelling across the whole span of tonight's story. Across a frozen sea to an island with no wildcats of its own, buried at last beside someone who valued her enough to make the crossing worth the risk. Along the roads and grain routes stretching east from the Fertile Crescent, standing in for a goddess's chariot hunting rats inside temple granaries, marked in clay tablets as either good luck or bad. Worshipped so completely in Egypt that one accidental death could end in a foreign diplomat torn apart by a grieving crowd. Carried by Roman soldiers to a cold garrison in Britain, and then centuries later feared, hunted, and finally forgiven again by the very same continent. Loaded onto wooden ships bound for oceans, no one had ever charted curled in the arms of a woman who chose to hold on to her rather than run right up until the very end. Exhibited finally under Victorian glass, judged for the first time not on what she could do but simply on how she looked doing nothing at all. Here at the end of the story, the honest answer is not particularly dramatic, and that in its own way might be the most important thing this whole journey has had to say. She was never tamed in the way a horse is broken or a dog is trained. Nobody ever conquered her. Nobody ever fully controlled her. Not the farmers who first tolerated her near their grain, not the priests who built her temples, not the sailors who trusted her with their lives at sea, not even the breeders who spent a century and a half trying to shape her outward appearance into something new. Every single one of those chapters, when you look closely, was really the story of humans slowly, imperfectly learning how to deserve her continued presence, rather than the story of anyone successfully bending her to their will, and somehow against every reasonable expectation for an animal built entirely around solitude, it worked. In country after country, culture after culture, cats now share more human homes than almost any other animal on the planet, an outcome nobody in this entire story ever engineered on purpose. Nobody scheduled it. Nobody voted on it. It simply happened one grain store, one temple, one ship, one fireside at a time, until a solitary desert hunter became one of the most quietly ordinary sights in millions of households across the globe. That is worth sitting with, especially if you have ever felt a small pang of jealousy watching a dog greet its owner with unrestrained, unconditional joy, while your own cat glances up once decides you're acceptable for now and goes back to sleep. A dog's love was in large part selected for bred deliberately across thousands of years into an animal whose ancestors already lived in cooperative packs, primed for devotion before a single collar was ever invented. A cat's affection, when you actually receive it, was never selected for at all. It survived 10,000 years of total creative freedom to simply walk away, and did not. Every slow blink, every purr against your side on a hard night, every unbothered decision to sleep in the same room as you rather than the next room over is freely given by an animal who has never once in the entire span of this story needed to give it. Maybe that is what makes it worth so much. Not because it is bigger or louder or easier to see, because it never had to happen at all. And across 10,000 years in 10,000 different forms, it kept happening anyway. You inherited every part of this story, whether you ever knew it before tonight or not. The instinct behind that same cat pouncing on a toy mouse across your living room floor traces directly back to a hunter stalking real prey across open desert sand. The stubborn private nature that sometimes frustrates you traces back to millions of years spent as a solitary predator who truly never needed anyone else to survive. The particular way she watches a closed door, waiting patient, entirely certain it will eventually open for her, is not so different from the patience of an ancestor waiting at the edge of a grain store that had not yet learned to trust her. And the quiet, steady presence curled up somewhere near you tonight, whether asleep on a windowsill tucked against your side or simply somewhere else in the house, doing exactly as she pleases, carries the entire 10,000-year arc of everything we have covered together this evening inside her, without knowing a single word of it, without needing to. She is still on some deep and unhurried level exactly the animal we met at the very start of this story. Still watching. Still choosing, still in her own quiet way deciding every single day that this particular arrangement, whatever we ought to call it, remains worth staying for. Look closely enough on a quiet night like this one, and you can still see the desert in her, in the way she freezes at a sudden sound, in the way her pupils widen in low light, in the perfect, unhurried stillness she can hold for longer than any human ever could. 10,000 years of firelight temples, ships, and parlours layered over the top of an animal who underneath all of it never actually agreed to change. And on that thought, it feels like the right moment to let this particular story rest for tonight. Thank you truly for spending these past few hours here with me, wherever in the world you happen to be listening from tonight. Stories like this one only keep finding their way to new ears because of people willing to give them a little support, so if tonight's journey through 10,000 years of cats and humans kept you good company, consider leaving this video a like or passing it along to another cat lover you think might enjoy drifting off to it as much as I hope you have. And if you're not already subscribed, it costs nothing and helps far more than you might expect, letting me know there are more nights like this one worth preparing for you. If you have not already told me earlier tonight, I would love to know where in the world you're tucked in from this evening and what time it happens to be there right now. There is something quietly wonderful about picturing this same story landing in so many different rooms in so many different corners of the world, all at roughly the same hour. And if you ever feel like supporting this little project a bit further, there is a membership option available for exactly that entirely optional, never expected, just there for anyone who wants to help keep these stories going. There are more stories waiting other quiet corners of history I would love to walk through together the next time you're ready to settle in for the night. other unexpected threads connecting the distant past to whatever ordinary, extraordinary thing happens to be resting near you right now. I hope you will come back and find out what they are. For tonight, though, that is where we leave things. Wherever you are, in whatever state this last hour finds you, let everything you were carrying when this story began feel a little lighter now than it did then. Let your eyes shut if they have not already. Let your breathing slow one long unhurried breath at a time. Let the room go quiet. Let the whole 10,000-year weight of this story settle softly into nothing more than a good deep rest. Whatever is curled up nearby, human or otherwise, is exactly where it's meant to be tonight. Sleep well,